Beaches link. Before I commence, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people who are the traditional custodians of the land on which Parliament sits. I would also like to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging of the Eora Nation and extend that respect to all First Nations people who are present or watching. Today's hearing is being conducted as a fully virtual hearing. This enables the work of the committee to continue during the COVID-19 pandemic without compromising the health and safety of staff or members. Today we'll be hearing from community representative groups, experts from environment, marine and health fields, as well as representatives from the school community. Before we commence, I would like to make some brief comments about the procedures for today's hearings. While parliamentary privilege applies to witnesses giving evidence today, it does not apply to what witnesses say outside of their evidence at the virtual public hearing. I therefore urge witnesses to be careful about comments you make to the media or to others after you complete your evidence. Committee hearings are not intended to provide a forum for people to make adverse reflections about others under the protection of parliamentary privilege. In that regard, it is important that witnesses focus on the issues raised by the inquiry's terms of reference and avoid naming individuals unnecessarily. All witnesses have a right to procedural fairness according to the Procedural Fairness Resolution adopted by the House in 2018. There may be some questions that a witness could only answer if they had more time or with certain documents to hand. In these circumstances, witnesses are advised that they can take a question on notice and provide an answer within 21 days. Today's proceedings are being recorded and a transcript will be placed on the committee's website once it becomes available. The hearing is also being broadcast and saved on Parliament's YouTube channel. Finally, a few notes on virtual hearing etiquette to minimise disruptions and assist our Hansard reporters. Can I ask committee members to clearly identify who questions are directed to? And can I ask everyone to please state their name when they begin speaking? Could everyone please mute their microphones when they're not speaking? Members and witnesses should avoid speaking over each other so we can all be heard clearly. I now welcome our first witnesses. First, could I start with Professor Byrne and then Dr. Hutchings and Dr. Ryle? Could you please state your full name and position title and swear either an oath or an affirmation from the cards that have been emailed to you by the Secretariat?
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Professor Maria Byrne. I and sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given to me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ryle.
My full name is William Robert Ryle. I make the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Dr. Ryle, your position or?
My position is as a retired environmental scientist, and I provide advice mostly these days to community groups.
Thank you. Dr. Hutchings.
Dr. Pat Hutchings, representing AMSA, the Australian Marine Scientists Association. The affirmation, solemnly and sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Dr. Hutchings. Can I invite each of the witnesses who wish to make an opening statement to make a short opening statement of no more than 3 minutes, perhaps starting with you, Professor Byrne and or Dr. Hutchings?
I'm going to give a submission on behalf of Dr. Patricia Hutchings and myself, Professor Maria Byrne, combined, because we are both representing the Australian Marine Sciences Association. We are marine biologists. Pat is expert on the benthic communities, which are dominated by polychaete worms, is her expertise. And Dr. Hutchings has worked extensively on the biodiversity of Sydney Harbour. She led the port survey for marine invasive species for the Sydney Ports Authority and was a member of the ecology panel for the Sydney Olympics. I've worked on invertebrates, including sea urchins and oysters in the Sydney Harbour with respect to their response to environmental stresses. So I did the ecotoxicology of the Sydney Olympic Park for the Sydney Olympics. So we are here to talk about the marine environment. That's the terms of reference we address. The EIS and submissions report did not sufficiently consider the impacts of construction of the immersion tube tunnel to the marine environment and species throughout Sydney Harbour, caused by the redistribution of contaminated and non-contaminated sediments. Highly toxic chemicals will be released from the fine particles and certainly from the sediment pore water, and the release of a potentially toxic cocktail into the water was not at all considered. The water quality of Sydney Harbour has improved immensely over recent decades since the remediation of Homebush Bay and other measures. The harbour is now one of the most diverse in the world in terms of number of species, and many of which live in the sediments. In many areas, seagrass and kelp have returned, including in the area of the tunnel construction. This renewed diversity has absolutely thrived because contaminants from the industrial history of Sydney Harbour are sequestered in the sediments, and this is where they should remain. The tunnel project risks the reversal of all these positive gains we have had for our very, very iconic Sydney Harbour. It is well known that the harbour sediments have high levels of contaminants, and these are persistent. They'll be with us for hundreds of years, and we can't do anything about that. This includes sediments in the corridor of the tunnel, in the construction support sites. And this was shown in the contaminants report, the Golden Douglas report of 2017. This report was kept confidential during the EIS stage. This demonstrates lack of transparency. The mixture of contaminants in the sediments includes banned and poisonous chemicals that are carcinogenic to humans, toxins, and biocides such as copper and tributyl tin, which are highly damaging and in fact cause instant death to many marine animals. The sediments of both ends of the tunnel corridor where the dams will be made are highly contaminated. The sediments of Barry's Bay support site contain amongst the highest levels of tributyl tin, dioxins, mercury, and many more, known for marine sediments and well above the national quality guideline levels. And this is because this area was a shipbuilding yard for years where the boats were cleaned, releasing the paints, the anti-foul paint with the tributyl tin into the harbour. Tributyl tin is a biocide. It kills marine embryos and interferes with skeleton formation and reproduction in mollusks. I've actually honestly seen many TBT oysters, and they're not good to look at. That's an aside. The organisms that live in the sediment form the bottom of the food chain as food for fish and prawns. The disturbed sediments are eaten by benthic animals, and the pollutants retained in their bodies will just move up the food chain as these contaminated animals are eaten. We already know that fish in the area of the tunnel construction are contaminated. The government tells us that we shouldn't eat them, and that's been there for a long time. And the birds which eat the fish will be spreading the contaminants far and wide.
Professor Byrne, can I just ask you to please just come towards the end of your statement, please?
I'm combining it for the two of us.
Okay, sure, but still.
Okay. So there's no way that the silk curtains and the backhoe dredge will contain the sediments because the area is dynamic with strong water movement. The tunnel construction will disturb the sediments, and there will be the movements between Barry's Bay, Snails Bay, White Bay, and Roselle rail yards have a high potential to disturb and redistribute sediments. Measurements to contain and track those plumes are not convincing, nor is the assumed loss of fine sediments. There's no mention to monitor contamination in the water. Offshore disposal is also of great concern. There was additional analyses that were commissioned for the Commonwealth, but this information was not provided. So we have particular concerns for the contaminated sediments by dioxins and tributyl tin, and how will they be managed with respect to offshore dumping in White Bay on barges. That's that containment needs careful management. In summary, it is clear that there have been procedural deficiencies with the WHT, the Western Harbour Tunnel process, including an inadequate EIS, incomplete environmental risk analysis with respect to the marine environment, and lack of transparency. The revised environmental measures do not include measures to address the risk of environmental poisoning. That's really important. The risk analysis will need to be revisited with special attention to the design and management of the dredging program and construction support sites and offshore disposal. Improved sediment sampling along the construction site to establish rigorous baseline data prior to construction and plans for monitoring. We note that monitoring and recovery programs were not detailed. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Byrne. Can I invite Dr. Ryle to make an opening statement if you so wish.
Yes, Bill Ryle. My expertise is in the assessment, management and remediation of contaminated land, which includes sediments. I've had a lot of experience with remediation of sediments and most of the big sediment remediation projects undertaken in New South Wales. So my submission is totally devoted to the contaminated land. Onshore, the environmental impact statement and the subsequent submissions report identified 18 potentially contaminated sites along the route of the bored tunnel in sandstone rock. However, no investigation was carried out in those areas. Consequently, the environmental impact of these cannot be obtained. In my view, this is a fatal flaw of the CIS, and the EPA should have requested, or required rather, revision of the EIS to address these issues. With respect to the marine works that Professor Burns stated, which I agree with all of her comments, to my ability as a non-specialist, the dredging is going to be carried out on almost 1 million cubic metres of sediment. That's approximately 400 Olympic swimming pools of sediment that's going to be removed. Of that, the EIS states there's 142,500 cubic metres of this sediment is contaminated. This is an aspect of the EIS that's totally wrong, and I'll explain that in a minute. But the problem is that the EIS says that the management of and minimisation of sediment dispersion into Sydney Harbour will be maintained by shallow silt curtains, 2 to 3 metres floating from the surface. However, the water depth within the alignment of the immersed tube tunnel ranges from 11 to 15 metres. The disturbance of the sediments obviously takes place at the seafloor, which is some 8 metres at least below the level of the silt curtain. Professor Burns rightly said the currents are strong in these areas, and the sediment will be swept away into the waters of Sydney Harbour. The impact of this is not addressed by the EIS. Furthermore, the EPA rather, has in their review has not carried out a critical review of either particularly the sediment in the ITT. It did carry out a very rigorous assessment of the lack of environmental investigation of the onshore contaminated areas, and some 18 pages of their requirements and observations were made. And this was good. This is a standard I would expect and would have delivered myself when I was working as capacity of site auditor. However, with respect to the sediments, the EPA produced a document dated the last day available for submissions of 1.5 pages in length. It basically did not address any of the important contamination issues. And my view is that the EPA should have produced something much more robust than this. And there's another reason for that too, because the community needs to be assured that proper environmental protection measures will be implemented. Also, this EIS and the subsequent reports will be read with interest by contractors who now believe that the EPA is not very concerned about the migration of the contaminants into the harbour. When they excavate the uncontaminated sediments, which is 825,000 cubic metres, these sediments will disperse into the harbour. And I think it's reasonable now that the EPA, the consultants will think, well, the EPA is not particularly worried about it. We can go ahead and employ a fast, quick method to excavate these sediments and get them treated and out of the way, whereas this shouldn't be the case at all. In my view, the EIS failed on that. And I think the EPA, with respect to the contaminated and uncontaminated sediments, the EPA has failed the community. I think there was evidence given by the Mayor of Inner West Council this week about her concerns for human use of the waters in proximity to the works. And, I subscribe to that too. So, what else do I want to say? I looked at the data that the EIS was based upon. If you recall, the Transport for New South Wales refused to provide to me the consultant's report that identified the investigation works, which would give the concentrations of the chemicals of concern and their distribution both laterally and at depth. They refused to give me this. They said it's commercial in confidence. There was public outcry from the community, media attention to this, and they finally gave this report to me. From that report, I was able to plot the results of the
Dr. Ryle, can I ask you also just to come towards the end of your statement, please? We do want to get to questioning.
Yep. I was able to then accurately determine the distribution of the contaminated sediments. It's nothing like what's stated in the EIS. I've asked Transport for New South Wales for a copy of the report documenting their position, and they said there isn't such a report. That's unbelievable to me. What I've suggested now is that there's a better way of doing the remediation, because the contaminated sediments are not distributed along the entire alignment of the ITT. They're restricted to both ends of it, near Relbourne Point in Birchgrove and near the Waverton coal loader. That's where they propose to put a cofferdam around it, where the immersed tube tunnel will join the bored tunnels. And this is basically a waterproof enclosure that most of the contaminated sediments in that, and I say they should be using that facility at Birchgrove and at Waverton to remove the contaminated sediments. Then there's negligible impact from contaminated sediments to the waters of Sydney Harbour. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I thank both sets of witnesses for the very extensive opening statements. If you haven't already emailed them through to the Secretary, could you please? That would be most useful. Can I just kick off questioning? We'll go to opposition questioning first before we go to the crossbench and then the government. Can I just kick off with a really basic question to you, Professor Byrne and Dr. Hutchings? Insofar as you're describing the disturbance that would be caused, would you characterise the risk to the harbour and to marine life as severe, moderate? How, for the public to understand, what is the magnitude of what you're describing here?
It's severe because and a lot of the information is not clear, because this is a cocktail of chemicals. It's not just tributyl tin. It's not just mercury. It's not just arsenic. It's the combination of toxic chemicals. And I know from my ecotoxicology work that toxic mixtures, chemical mixtures, are highly toxic. So certainly within the area of the tunnel, and up and down the harbour, there will be severe. Obviously, at the heads of Sydney Harbour, it'll be less severe. So the severity of the impact will depend on how the sediments and the chemicals move. And the Gladstone, actually, a really good example of how this can go wrong is Gladstone Harbor. The dredging of Gladstone Harbor was absolutely diabolical. For weeks and weeks and weeks after, there were fish with ulcers and dead, and fishing had to stop. Had orange spot all over them. They couldn't be marketed. So these were all from the contaminants from the Gladstone Harbor dredging. So there are precedent in Australia for similar catastrophic responses of marine organisms to dredging.
And to what extent are the effects you're describing concentrated in the harbour, or to what extent would they sort of seep out into the wider ocean or to the wider coast?
The wider coast, I wouldn't be able to, I would think not. I don't know I'm not an oceanographer, so I can't say how the waters will move, but we do know that the waters move up and down the harbour. The plumes could spread 35 kilometres in Gladstone. So 35 kilometres is a big distance. Now, Gladstone Harbour is not the same as Sydney Harbour, but the interesting thing about Sydney Harbour is you've got a long, narrow harbour where things can go back and forth and go back and forth for quite some time. We're not talking about right all to the open ocean. We've got a long harbour, and if you ever see the way the currents move, even with the ferries going back and forth, there's lots of opportunities for contaminants to go west and east of the site.
Well, I was just going to ask, it's not unreasonable to expect that some of the sediment that's disturbed will make its way to Parramatta and back?
Pat Hutchings, I think the answer is we don't quite know. There wasn't a detailed oceanographic study carried out by the EAS, but I would suspect that some sediments, the contaminants are attached to some of those sediments. And so when the sediments get dispersed, they're going to be washed up and down the river and they're going to get trapped in some of the upper reaches of each of the bays. And that's where a lot of the human activity occurs. But those are the areas where we're seeing re-establishment of seagrasses and kelp beds.
And is it your view that the risks that you're describing can be mitigated?
Pat Hutchings, I really don't know because we know that the silt curtains are not going to go down to the bottom of the attached to the sediments. I think it's very likely. It's going to be very difficult to mitigate them. Yeah. Also, the data provided in the EIS doesn't provide really good baseline studies, let alone of the sediments or of the fauna. So it's going to be really difficult to monitor how recovery occurs, or when pollution events occur during, say, big storm activities and things. How the fauna and the sediments are going to be mitigated. I don't know.
So to answer your question, I feel that the mitigation, Maria Byrne, I feel that the EIS was so poor that if we wanted to figure out how damage could be mitigated, we were not informed by the works that were done by the consultants for the Western Harbour Tunnel. I suggest the EIS has to be redone to answer your question, Honourable Member, to see if it can be mitigated.
Look, I'm just going to ask the same question of Dr. Ryle and then perhaps pass to my colleague if she wishes to ask any questions. So Dr. Ryle, would you describe the risks that you're describing as severe? And if so, do you think they can be mitigated?
It's Bill Ryle. Yes, I think they are severe. The chemical mixtures are very toxic. I understand that. It's not my field of expertise, but I've been around long enough to understand that. I say that it can be mitigated. And my submission to the EIS and the submission to this inquiry has been that there needs to be remediation of the contaminated sediments in enclosed spaces in those cofferdams that I've mentioned. These are watertight areas. No water will get out of that. That solves the problem with the contaminated sediments. Now, the 825,000 cubic metres of uncontaminated sediment is to be carried out in waters from 11 to 15 metres deep. I say that they should use full depth silt curtains, which are anchored to the bottom, anchored to the sea floor. This has been done elsewhere with great success in estuarine environments where currents are strong, and that solves both problems, I think.
And just finally, the cost of mitigation, are the measures you're describing particularly cost prohibitive or not?
Well, firstly, the contaminated sediments, don't forget that the EIS totally misled everyone with the volume. The volume is totally wrong. Transport for New South Wales have never acknowledged that. They've never given me a document that shows that they're right. So it's a fraction of what the EIS says. The contamination, as I said earlier, is concentrated near Yarralban Point and near the Waverton and Coal Loader, within or very close to the coffer dams. So that removes that one. From the other sediments that are going to be released to the harbour by excavation, dredging of the uncontaminated sediments can be controlled, as I said, by full depth silt curtains.
Thank you. I'll just pass to my colleague if she wishes to ask any questions.
Yeah, hi. Just one quick question. Thank you to all of you for your detailed work on this. Just in relation to, so I know your comments about the work done on the EIS being far from sufficient. In all of your views, is this a case of us not really having the available tools to properly understand the risks here, or is it more a case of the work just not being done so that we can understand the risks here on this project?
May I answer that?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Bill Ryle, the EIS is totally defective in that it has not assessed the risk, the impact of these things. There are tools around that can assess this. And the EPA, in their review, should have demanded that that be done. So my answer to that is yes, it can be done and should have been done, wasn't done, and the EIS is defective.
And I'll add to that,
Maria Byrne.
is that the EIS completely ignored hundreds of papers that have been published on Sydney Harbour. So the information was already there. So it just wasn't convenient for them to consult it. That's all we can surmise. It was a bit of an inconvenient truth, if you will. All this work that Dr. Hutchings and all the other people that have worked on the Sydney Harbour for decades, it was not cited.
May I comment?
Yep.
It's Bill Ryle. Again, I look to the EPA to have provided this information in their review of the sediment remediation. They didn't assess this at all. And for the contaminated sediments, as I said, 1.5 pages, just three suggestions, no requirements. The EPA should have picked this up and should have required that the EPA be revised. Thank you.
Opposition questioning time has expired. Ms. Boyd, the call is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for your fabulous submissions and for appearing today. It seems to me that we could spend, well over a week with this committee going through all of the individual objections to this EIS and still not properly have got to the bottom of it. And I'm very grateful for you bringing your expertise here today. If the work had been done, if the research had been done appropriately, if the right investigations had been made, if the appropriate mitigation measures had been suggested, what do you think the impact on the total cost of this project would have been?
Maria Byrne, I'm not a financial expert, so I can't answer that question. Yeah. But I do think that if they had done a proper assessment, they might have thought the design of the whole project. If they looked at the weight of evidence, and I'm not a financial person, a weight of evidence of this cost, a weight of evidence for doing it this way, a weight of evidence for doing it that way, with respect to remediation of contamination or whatever the expensive items that are required, then we might not have had an immersion tube tunnel. We might have had a different type of tunnel.
Okay. May I speak?
Yes, please.
Bill Ryle. The cost of addressing the contaminated sediments the way I've suggested would be drastically less than what it would cost to implement the EIS. The EIS talks about 142,500 cubic meters. It's nothing like that. So if you go ahead, and some contractors I speak to have said, well, the EPA hasn't kind of put much pressure on us. We can just go in there and rip this out and do it quickly and make money out of this. Now, if it's done properly, as I suggest, the cost and time and lack of and lessening of impact to the community of dealing with the contaminated sediments is huge. Probably to do the remediation works as the EIS suggested would be in excess of $100 million. And remember, they proposed to treat it and then to dispose of it into landfill. So you've probably got 200,000 cubic meters of contaminated, 142,000, more than that by the time it's stabilized and treated. That's got to go to landfill. Probably the total cost of that is in the order of $100 million. My recommendation to do it enclosed in the cofferdams, far less volume, maybe something like 20% of what the EIS states, and all the costs, benefits from that flow. So it's going to be cheaper to do it properly.
So on that basis then, Dr. Ryle, are you saying that if we were to pause, do a new EIS and actually consider the types of solutions that you have suggested, the project could still go ahead, but in a more beneficial way for the people of New South Wales and the government from a cost perspective?
Bill Ryle, that's correct. I agree with that.
Thank you. I noticed that both of your submissions are primarily focused on the Western Harbour Tunnel. I'll ask you first, Dr. Ryle, have you done any investigations in relation to the Beaches Link component of this project and the impact on marine ecosystems?
No.
Could I ask the...
Okay, Pat Hutchings.
Thank you.
When we did the survey of the biodiversity of Sydney Harbour, that area that you're referring to was very poor, had been very poorly sampled. So we don't have the sort of data that we would need to compare. So that's why Professor Byrne and I have concentrated on the area between Birch Grove and Barry's Bay, where we have far more data. And the EIS did not provide adequate data on the benthos and the sediment contamination in those areas.
Thank you. So, sorry, just to confirm, have either of you done research or I guess any sorts of investigations in relation to for example, the dive catchment areas, in contaminated landfill areas, etc., around the Beaches Link part of the project, or
No.
no?
Bill Ryle, no. It was enough to do it on the harbour, I thought, which is the most sensitive environmental phase of the Western Harbour Tunnel. So I've concentrated on that.
Thank you. Dr. Ryle, in your submission, you note that you haven't had a response from the EPA or Transport for New South Wales in relation to the large volumes of sediments the EIS has stated. Have you received that response yet?
No, I have not.
Perhaps we could follow that up for you as a committee. What would be the potential consequences on the marine ecosystems if the contaminated sediments were disturbed and not contained? Perhaps that's a question for you again, Dr. Hutchins.
I think it could be, Pat Hutchings, I think it could have a severe impact. As Professor Byrne suggested in her opening remarks, Sydney Harbour has been, the quality of the biodiversity, or the amount of biodiversity in the harbour has been increasing over time. And I could see this as a backward step. We certainly would increase the sediment rates, turbidity in the water. We would certainly lose a lot of those seagrass beds and kelp beds that have been recovering.
And could you talk us through the impacts, not just of contamination, but also of noise and vibration in the construction process on marine life in particular?
Pat Hutchings, I think we certainly know that a lot of animals that live in the benthos are very susceptible to vibration and move away, but how far they can move and quickly enough to avoid being impacted by the excavation, I don't know. And nothing was reported in the EIS on these topics.
And we know that, Maria Byrne here, we know that big animals, like some of the big fishes and the other bigger marine organisms, would avoid noise. That's well known, but that's not our expertise. And we spoke really to the organisms that live on and in the sediment, and the animals that are really abundant in Sydney Harbour that we have expertise in. So things like marine mammals, the penguins that are sometimes you see at the ferry wharfs, those would probably not be around. They would avoid it. But again, that's not my expertise.
Thank you. Are there any threatened species that are potentially at risk in the harbour?
Maria Byrne, there is that in the AMSA submission, not in in the big submission we wrote. We pointed out that there is some endangered seahorses. There is some endangered soft corals that do live in the harbour. There is and the blue penguins I just mentioned. All of those organisms could be affected by the project. The details of that really are not clear. They would have to have been a proper study on that aspect to address your question in the EIS.
Thank you. I've only got time for one last question. Dr. Ryle, you note, and I guess this comes back to the beginning of this set of questioning, you would normally expect the EPA to have stepped in to ensure that this EIS didn't have all of the flaws that have been identified. Is that normal? Is that usual in your experience for the EPA not to have stepped in a situation like this?
It's Bill Ryle. Most abnormal, I would have thought. The EPA's job is to protect the environment and the health of the population with respect to contamination. I would have expected the EPA to do a thorough review, as they did for the onshore area, but not for the most sensitive area, which is the remediation of the sediments, the excavation of them. Very, very disappointing submission by the EPA in this respect.
I just say crossbench time has come to an end, so we will go to the government. Who from the government would like to call?
Shane Mallard.
Go ahead, Mr. Mallard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for appearing today and giving us your submission. I might just follow up on the tail of that question from Ms. Boyd. I mean, if the EPA hasn't responded, would you not say the EPA does not agree with your assessment of the flaws in the EIS?
I'm sorry, say that again. I don't understand your question.
Well, you were saying you were disappointed the EPA had not responded to your concerns around the EIS in regards to the tunnel. And I'm just putting it to you that if they didn't respond, it was because they did not agree with your assessment?
Bill Ryle, the EPA 100% would agree with my assessment. I was a site auditor for a very long time. I'm very familiar with what the EPA does and doesn't do. They should have done that.
But the evidence is that they didn't respond. So we can only assume that they have a different opinion about the seriousness of the impacts that you're suggesting.
Bill Ryle, well, don't forget their submission was made on the last day available for submissions. It was a page and a half. It's been put to me by residents here that, gee, they must have forgotten about it, because don't forget they did a very thorough assessment of the onshore contamination, of which there was no investigation of. 18 pages of detailed requirements. Nothing like that, though, on the most sensitive part of the whole project. The EPA surely would know. They've got very competent people in there. I've known them for decades. Why they didn't do it is beyond my comprehension.
I guess at the end of the day, we don't have that answer. It's conjecture what residents say and why they put in the last day. I want to ask you both a question. I mean, there's no use me digging through the individual issues you've gone through quite thoroughly with the opposition and crossbench in terms of your critique of the EIS. So I'm going to step one step back. Do you support, in principle, another harbour crossing, a tunnel crossing for the harbour?
It's Bill Ryle, I'll leap in. I do support it. I would have liked, of course, to have seen more public transport accommodated by it. But, you know, my professional integrity and, you know, my professional interests are that the scientific work of which I'm expert in is done properly, and it wasn't.
Okay.
And Maria Byrne here. We're the Australian Marine Science Association. There's 1,000 members or more across Australia, 200 across or more across New South Wales. We all live in different constituencies. We're not talking about roads and traffic. We're talking about the marine environment. So, Honourable Member, I cannot answer that question.
Okay, that's interesting. And there is a public transport, Mr. sorry, I've got, the screen says Bill. I've got to get your surname. There is a public transport link. There's a separately tunnel going across or under the harbour, of course, as we know, the metro, the revolutionary metro rail system, which is really going to change Sydney's public transport. So I'm pretty proud of. But so essentially, if we boil this down, you're very critical of the EIS. You say it didn't address the key issues, and that's that, and you've listed those issues. It's essentially, if we had 10 scientists in the room, we'd get 20 opinions. We're always going to have criticism of studies and EISs and professional opinions. I mean, surely the consultants use highly qualified people to do their EIS. Heads, what do they do? High school students?
I would hope they use very competent people. However, the EPA has made and endorsed guidelines that consultants follow in the assessment of contaminated land, which includes sediments. And I would expect that the consultants follow that. And it's the objective of the EIS, remember, of course, is to assess the impact of these issues. And to assess the impact, one needs to know what is going to happen. And we don't know on the onshore, and we've got a few clues about the offshore, the way it is, which I say is defective, as I said before. Thank you.
When the EIS was, and correct me if I got this wrong, but when the EIS was put on exhibition, you all made submissions around these flaws you saw?
Australian,
that is
Pat
correct.
Hutchings, AMSA, we certainly made a submission, and we were concerned about the lack of information about the benthos and of the distribution of sediments and their associated contamination.
And Maria Byrne here. I'm not saying that the scientists that contributed to the EIS were not professionals. They, of course, were professionals, but maybe they didn't have enough time, because there might have been 100 publications of rigorous research on Sydney Harbour that was not consulted. And I point out that the Golder-Douglas report of 2017, which was Science of Contamination, was confidential, so we couldn't even read it.
Okay. I'm old enough to remember the Sydney Harbour tunnel being built, and I'm old enough to remember the concerns it was end of the world in terms of the harbour, the biodiversity and the harbour floor and the mud stirred up and all that. But it seems that Mother Nature has rebounded quite strongly around the harbour tunnel. I mean, we now allow fishing and recreational fishing all through there. And you go down to Woolloomooloo Bay and people are fishing all the time. There seems, and around at Rushcutters Bay, there's plenty of sea life around there, much more than there was 20 or 30 years ago. So were there lessons learned from the harbour tunnel that can be applied to this new tunnel?
Pat Hutchings, I think, again, the harbour has been improving. The harbour has been improving, yeah. But that's in part also because they've been reducing some of the stormwater creeks going into the harbour and things. And there was plenty of signs all around Sydney Harbour saying, do not eat these fish.
I know that.
So while there's lots of fish, they're not suggesting that you eat them because they are contaminated. The EPA has published that data.
Yeah, not west of the bridge. You're not supposed to eat them. That's right.
Yeah,
all right, my colleague Ben Franklin wants to ask some questions, so I will now, if there's...
Sorry, may I comment on that issue that you just raised?
Sorry, Bill. Yep.
So it's Bill Ryle. It's well known and been documented for decades that the environmental condition of the sediments in Sydney Harbour improves as you get to the easterly direction.
Right.
As we go further west, the contamination is huge. Remember, just upstream from where they propose to put the tunnel is Cockatoo Island. And the sediments there remain unremediated, and I would suggest they're amongst some of the most highest contaminated sediments in the world.
Oh yeah, Pyrmont was a huge abattoir, and the contamination in that area was, appalling. I'll defer to my colleague, Mr. Franklin.
Thanks very much, Mr. Mallard. Now, apologies, I'm subbing in for another member on this committee today who is normally here but has another committee inquiry at the same time. So apologies, I'm not as much up to speed as the other members. But I just wanted to go, Professor Byrne and Dr. Hutchings, to your submission. And there was one of the lines in it was, crucially, there are no management measures to monitor dissolved toxicants in the waters of Sydney Harbour. I was wondering if you could speak a little more specifically to what should be in place, A, and B, if you could perhaps talk about what has been done in similar projects in the past with regard to the structure that's been set up to manage that issue.
Professor Byrne here. I'll first explain how I came across this. The risk assessment matrix was quite hard to navigate. And so you have the two documents, the measures. So the measures and the threats and the measures. So when you went from back, you realized, yes, the toxicants were considered with respect to human health and the sediment plume. There was not a single mention in the risk assessment matrix of the release of toxic chemicals dissolved into water. And that has potential to affect not only the people at Don Fraser Baths, but the animals in the water. So, what?
Sorry, I'm
then-
just very conscious we only have 1 minute left. I'm just particularly
So-
keen to see how this is done in other projects in the past.
So they would have to be real-time monitoring of the water as the project goes by. So they would have to have, just like they did at the Olympics, the waters were delivered on a Monday and we had the test done by Wednesday because they were so paranoid of the real-time movement of toxicants. So that's what has to be done, the proponents. And then you see that adds to the expense. The water has to be monitored every single day and reported on a website every single day. So the people at Dawn Fraser Baths said, well, I won't go swimming today or this week or this month. So real-time monitoring of toxics in the water was not mentioned in the EIS and has to be done.
I'm going to draw this session to a close there. Can I thank
you for your questions, everyone.
Thank you, Professor Byrne, and thank you, Dr. Hutchins, and
Thank you.
For your attendance today. I understand that you may have taken some questions on notice. If so, you'll be given 21 days to return an answer after receipt of the transcript from the Secretariat. Again, we thank you for taking the time. You are excused. Can I invite the Secretariat to please admit our next set of witnesses?
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
So the guy from
I now welcome our next set of witnesses from Asthma Australia, the Lung Foundation, and of course, Private Citizen as well. I will now ask each of the witnesses to please state your name and position, or take an oath or affirmation as has been emailed to you by the Secretariat, starting with you, Ms. Goldman.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Goldman and I'm the CEO of Asthma Australia. And I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Brooke.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Mark Brooke and I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Lung Foundation Australia. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Dr. Bridge.
Just before I do the affirmation, I'd like to correct the record. I'm down on the schedule of speakers as a doctor. In fact, I do not hold a PhD. In relation to the affirmation, I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Bridge. I will now invite each of the witnesses to make a short opening statement if they so wish. No more than 3 minutes, please. And we'll start again with Ms. Goldman.
Thank you. And I'm going to provide an introduction on behalf of Asthma Australia and Lung Foundation Australia. We welcome the opportunity to expand on our submission to this important inquiry. There is now very strong evidence demonstrating the immediate and long-term health effects of traffic-related air pollution on humans, highlighting a greater magnitude of impact than previously understood and showing that there is no safe lower limit of exposure. Approximately 1 in 3 New South Wales residents have a respiratory condition, and while air pollution is harmful to everyone, the most vulnerable suffer the most harm, and children and young adults with respiratory conditions are particularly at risk from the effects of air pollution because they have faster breathing rates and their lungs are still developing. Air pollution is also both a risk factor for the development of asthma as well as a trigger for asthma symptoms in people who have the condition. And the same can be said for other respiratory conditions, highlighting just how devastating air pollution can be for many local residents. Living in close proximity to high traffic volume is also associated with a range of adverse health outcomes, including hospitalisation as a result of asthma and other respiratory conditions. And both Asthma Australia and Lung Foundation Australia are consumer-focused organisations. And I'd like to take this opportunity to share with the committee the impacts of air pollution on people with asthma in their own words. This is a quote from one of our asthma champions, Tara, which just demonstrates the impacts of traffic-related pollution for people with asthma in being able to do daily activities that some of us take for granted. I quote, "Running during lockdown, I have noticed a dramatic improvement, not only in my asthma while running, but also in endurance and recovery time. Pre-lockdown, running after 4 p.m. near congested areas would trigger my asthma, resulting in asthma flare-ups requiring immediate medication, Ventolin, or I would be unable to continue running. Treadmills are a fantastic option to an extent, but they are not the most beneficial option for those trying to increase their lung capacity." End quote. Our joint submission to this inquiry made a number of suggestions which, if implemented, would minimise the impact of air pollution associated with the Western Harbour Tunnel and Beaches link, and we encourage the committee to consider these suggestions, as well as the severe short and long-term health impacts of air pollution outlined in our submission, and we are more than happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Ms. Goldman. Can I invite Mr. Bridge to make a short opening statement of no more than 3 minutes if you wish to?
Okay, thank you. I am an environmental scientist and I have been practicing in the field for about 40 years, just under 40 years. My area of speciality is in air quality and pollution monitoring and management, and I have been representative on professional bodies associated with air quality assessment for a considerable period of time. I'm here today because I've made a special study on environmental risk associated with crystalline silica exposures. And just in summary, I would say that crystalline silica is regarded as an occupational disease. And indeed, when I started my research well over 10 years ago, it was regarded as largely controlled even in the industrial setting. But more recently, there have been a number of cases of coal, miner's lung, which is effectively silicosis, and also tradesmen coming down with silicosis associated with exposure to manipulating manufactured stone and other things in the workplace setting. So it is back on the agenda as a health and safety risk, but it is still and remains largely unstudied in terms of the environmental risk. There are a few papers that have examined it, non-occupational exposures, and these have noted that there can be and there are cases of silicosis recorded. There are some cases recorded from the Western Desert Aborigines in Australia, from peoples in the Negev Desert, and in other cases there have also been cases recorded where farm animals have contracted silicosis where they've been near peak sites, things like quarries and other things. In summary, any time you have crystalline silica released to the environment near an ambient population, you have a risk that that population will contract silicosis. That risk can only be prevented and mitigated. Once you contract silicosis, then it is an incurable disease. It's the prevention rather than the cure that has to be accepted. In terms of environmental limits, these are a lot less than the occupational limits, and you cannot apply an occupational limit to an environmental setting. And the reason for that is that it is assumed that an occupational setting, you have healthy adults with a mature immune system working in the field for approximately 8 hours a day and 5 days a week or so, and then away from the exposure. In an environmental setting, you may have people with an existing lung disease, a COPD. You may have children with a poorly developed at this stage immune system, and those people need to be protected. Your exposures may also be 24 hours a day and up to 7 days a week. And under those circumstances, you need to have a much lower limit for your exposures. I'll end it there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bridge. And can I thank the witnesses for their opening statements? If you'd be kind enough to please email them through to the Secretariat, it would certainly assist Hansard and members as well. We'll now go to questioning, starting with the opposition. Ms. Moriarty.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you for attending today and for the work that you've done on this. I will, in fact, start with Mr. Bridge. Thank you for that. Can I get you to just expand on your comments here? Sorry, I couldn't find a submission, so it'll be useful to have you expand. I'm very acutely aware of the horrific results of silicosis and other issues like this on people. Can you expand on what you say the risks are to workers on this project? Is that really what your focus is, other than the environmental aspects, and also the risk to the community during construction?
There is a risk associated with workplace exposure. I would generally expect, though, that the occupational health and safety standards, and there's a workplace standard of 0.05 milligrams per cubic metre for crystalline silica exposure for workers. That's the WES currently in Australia. I would expect that the occupational hygienists associated with the project would be managing that on behalf of the workplace. The issue, however, becomes what about the community exposures and how does the plume travel away from the site, and what are the potential exposures in the environmental setting? So I would expect the occupational health and setting to be managed by workplace health and safety officers on site and monitored and managed by the representative government personnel, both in terms of personal exposure and also management of those.
Thank you. And to Ms. Goldman and Mr. Brooke, thank you for your submission. It's quite alarming information in your submission in relation to some health concerns. Can I get you to expand on that? So what specifically, I understand your overall concerns about traffic and air pollution. What are your specific concerns about this project? How will this be worse than existing traffic? Can we, will filtration help? What's specific about this project?
Would you like me to start, Mark?
Sure, Michelle.
Well, firstly, we'd encourage the New South Wales Department of Planning, Industry and Environment to conduct further inquiries and analysis to ensure that the best strategies in place. I want to draw your attention to the 2018 report of the New South Wales Public Accountability Committee, so the impact of the WestConnex project, because the recommendations in that report stated, recommendation 13, that the New South Wales government install on all current and future motorway tunnels filtration systems in order to reduce the level of pollutants emitted from ventilation stacks. And also there were recommendations around real-time publication of air quality data. So we know from lots of experience with other tunnel infrastructure projects in New South Wales and other jurisdictions that not enough time and analysis and investigation has gone into understanding and estimating the impacts, the health impacts. There's always a big focus on the environmental impacts. So looking at filtration is an absolutely essential one to try and minimise the level of emissions that are emitted from the stacks. But we would also recommend ongoing dust suppression measures. So Dr. Bridge has spoken about, silicosis, but dust is a problem in a whole range of areas. So especially during the period of time of construction of the tunnel, for that dust to be suppressed, capping of loads as well to reduce the level of dust that's in the environment and that's distributed, halting activities during certain weather events, such as when it's particularly windy and when that dust can be carried over a larger geographical area, and also ongoing air quality monitoring at schools and childcare centres. And I understand that there's a large number of schools and childcare centres in the vicinity of the tunnel, and I understand that information about that has already been provided to the committee from other other people who have presented to this hearing. So they would be key recommendations we would make.
Ms. Moriarty, through you, Mr. Chair, Mark Brook Lung Foundation. I think it's also incredibly important that we note that you can measure short-term impacts through monitoring, but what we need to understand about lung disease is that something like asthma, you might see a flare-up or an exacerbation. But as the national standards have shown, as the National Strategic Action Plan for Lung Conditions, which is the Department of Health's forward-looking plan, clearly demonstrates air quality is one of the leading burdens of disease, leading contributors of the burden of disease for lung conditions. And sadly, many of the lung conditions that the Lung Foundation represents will not be immediately apparent. It may take 20 or 30 years, as Mr. Bridges has pointed out, to see the full extent. If you think about something like lung cancer, which is traditionally associated with a history of tobacco usage, 1 in 5 patients diagnosed this year will have no history of smoking and will have other factors, including air pollution, contributing to their diagnosis of cancer. We see this with quite rare lung diseases, including pulmonary fibrosis. But if I could just add an adjunct to Mr. Bridges' evidence, I'd strongly suggest that the committee review the National Dust Diseases Task Force, so the federal government's Dust Diseases Task Force report, which makes a series of recommendations about air quality monitoring, not just within workplaces, within the broader community as well. Because as Mr. Bridges has quite rightly pointed out, the scourge of silicosis has returned, not just within workers, but also those associated with those workplaces in administrative roles.
Thank you. And just, I might just ask, given the times that we're in at the moment, we've got the pandemic, which I suspect, even if construction can go ahead and we open a little bit, we all suspect we'll be living with this for some time. When schools go back, it's recommended that they have windows open for cross ventilation. You're quite right to say there are a large number of schools in the construction zone for this. I mean, what risk does that pose to children if there's not an option to keep the windows closed while construction's happening? And this is probably going to go on for some time. What are the additional risks for children?
I think there, so Michelle Goldman from Asthma Australia, the additional risks are significant. So there is plenty of epidemiological research from numerous continents around the world which show a very strong link between exposure to nitrogen dioxide, the main emission in traffic pollution, and both the onset of asthma as well as the exacerbation of existing asthma, causing symptoms, flare-ups and requiring hospitalizations. And in some instances, it can be fatal. And indeed, I referred the committee to the death of a 9-year-old girl in the UK several years ago, where on her death certificate, it was reported that her death was as a consequence of air pollution and set legal precedent for the future. So it is an area of significant concern to us, especially exacerbated, as you've pointed out, in the current pandemic.
There is a direct relationship between exposure to fine particulate and mortality and morbidity. And those, within that relationship, the particle itself is toxic, but the particle can also be a carrier of other chemicals that are adsorbed onto the surface of the particle. And when breathed in and hit the lung tissue, that can then be desorbed from the particle and into the body, leading to the health outcome.
Can I just follow up on that, Ms. Moriarty? To what extent are you confident that the risks that you have identified are being properly mitigated?
Mr. Chair, if I could answer, it's Mike Brook from the Lung Foundation. I don't think we can be confident, if I'm honest with you, that the rise and the prevalence of lung disease as both a burden of disease and in mortality is ever increasing and is likely to outstrip cardiovascular disease as the leading cause of death in Australia within the next 15 to 20 years. So cumulatively, if you take the top 5 causes of death in Australia, lung diseases are 4 of those 5. And if you add them all together, are a factor by 5 over cardiovascular death. Now, cardiovascular death is also linked, I might add, to air pollution and air quality. But from our perspective, lung disease and the burden of lung disease is ever increasing, as are the number of patients. And I just probably just go back one step to Ms. Moriarty's question. I don't think we could simply just focus in on students. That's a very important, but there are also the teachers and the staff within those schools who will have existing lung diseases or other forms of chronic illness that also need to be cared for.
I think we will now go to the crossbench to take the questioning. I'm conscious that perhaps Mr. Bridge and Ms. Goldman didn't get a chance to answer that question, but if you do wish to add to any aspects of Mr. Brooks' answer, please do so on notice. Ms. Boyd.
I would support and endorse Mr. Brooks's response.
Thank you. Ms. Boyd.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all of you for attending this morning and for your detailed submissions, particularly Ms. Goldman and Mr. Brook in relation to the very detailed recommendations that you've suggested be put in place if this project in fact goes ahead. I just wanted to take a step back and look at, I guess, the body of knowledge in relation to air pollution that's grown over the last, I've noticed it particularly over the last 2 to 3 years, but also before that. Could you let the committee, I guess, could you fill us in a little bit on how quickly that understanding of the health impacts between air pollution and things like lung cancer has grown over the last few years of research? Mr. Brook.
Thank you, Ms. Boyd. It's Mark Brook from the Lung Foundation. I think we're talking about more than 2 or 3 years of research. So the Australian Centre of Excellence for Airways Quality in Australia has been a leader in this regard. And if we look back at other submissions that have happened over the last decade, there are particularly around bushfire smoke and the air particulate matter in bushfire smoke to indoor air quality and the use of radon in carpets. That's almost 20 years old, that research now. So I think you're right, there is an accumulative knowledge, and Australia has a very, very strong and powerful voice in air quality research, and Professor Guy Marks, who is at the University of Sydney and the Woolcock Institute, and it would be worthwhile reading some of his more recent papers, particularly around the principles of managing air quality into the future, and I'm happy to have those tabled separately.
Do you think, I guess, is there any evidence from your perspective that governments have adapted to that knowledge and understanding? Are they paying attention?
Again, it's Mark Brook from the Lung Foundation. My personal view is that the investment in air quality research is significantly less than the burden of disease quota. So if we think about asthma, for example, costing the Australian community $28 billion a year, but we look at the total sum of respiratory research and air quality research. We've commissioned a report by PwC in 2018 which identifies a lung disease and airways disease burden at being about 9% of total burden in this country, but research investment at being 2%. So there is a disproportionate lack of investment in air quality research, not just in terms of air quality monitoring, but also, as Mr. Bridges has pointed out, the types and understanding of products that are being used in both manufacturing, in transport. And again, we'd refer back to Ms. Goldman's evidence around the child in the UK setting a new precedent where her death has been attributed to diesel fumes on a major road next to which she lived. All of that evidence is now accumulated, but more, significantly more, must be done in not just using, not just investing in research, but also how to transparently and accurately report that in real time to people impacted, not just by lung disease, but the entire community. If we can, if I could be so bold as to suggest, if we can have iPhone watches available to us then we should be able to send messaging, and that is one of the critical recommendations about the National Strategic Action Plan for Lung Conditions, is real-time monitoring of air quality. But I'd finally add this point. When Sydney was shrouded in bushfires just 18 months ago, we could see what was in the air. We could feel it in our lungs. But sadly, a lot of air pollution is invisible to us, and we're breathing it and walking around in it every day. And it is that invisibility that has led to a laissez-faire approach and potentially a lack of investment in an incredibly important health concern.
Thank you, Ms. Goldman.
Michelle Goldman from Asthma Australia. Endorse all those comments by Mr. Brook. I would also add that whilst we've seen advancements in air quality research, which has improved our understanding, there's still a lot we don't know. So we still don't really understand what the cumulative long-term impacts of exposure to different pollutants are. But despite not knowing that, we know that the short-term impacts are particularly harmful. And people with asthma are like the canaries in the coal mine, because whilst things like lung cancer might only be seen 20, 30 years after being exposed to particular pollutants, with people with asthma, symptoms are immediate and people have flare-ups and require hospitalisation. So we know that the quality of our air desires improvement. And I'd say that the pace of change and government policy and regulation hasn't kept pace with the increase in our knowledge. And we've seen things like the NEPM, the National Environment Protection Measures, with very little changes over more than a decade, and still not keeping track with the knowledge that's now understood in terms of what levels of exposure are harmful to health. We know with some pollutants like NO2, there's no lower limit of exposure that's safe, and yet we have a standard, so there's no incentive to reduce the level of exceedances. So I would suggest that there's a lot of work that needs to be done to catch up with what we know, as well as ongoing, and as Mr. Brooks said, increased investment in research to fill the gaps in our understanding. And we acknowledge the Clean Air Act of the New South Wales government, and we think that is a really valuable opportunity to do something and to put in place some real practical measures that will make a difference to reducing the exposure of the population to air pollution. And as Mr. Brooks said, you know, there's some events where we are helpless to do much about it, like the bushfire event. Asthma Australia conducted a survey that was responded to by over 12,000 people. And it was alarming to read the findings, both qualitative and quantitative. It impacted all aspects of people's lives, physical, psychological, financial, social. But the most insightful finding was that despite heeding public health advice, despite staying indoors and closing windows, it didn't help protect people. They still experienced symptoms. They still required emergency care. So there's a lot more we need to do to be able to protect the community. We need a public health education campaign so people better understand the impacts of air pollution on health, especially in those instances where air pollution is invisible and odourless, so that people can be made aware and can at least take the measures within their control to avoid exposure and protect their health and well-being. And I would just note that Asthma Australia is developing an Air Smart public education campaign, which was called for and recommended by both the Royal Commission into National Natural Disaster Arrangements, as well as the New South Wales Bushfire Inquiry. So we look forward to piloting that in New South Wales in early 2022.
Thank you. Can I ask you just, sorry, Mr. Bridge.
Yes, I was just going to build on Mr. Brooks's statement earlier. When you do see a plume of materials rising, a plume from a chimney or a plume from a stockpile or somewhere else, that's typically only the visible particles. and they are perhaps a PM15 and above. There is contained within that plume an invisible plume that cannot be seen unless you have particular air quality, particular way of standing where the sun is. And it's that invisible plume that has the greater health risk.
Thank you. Could I ask you, sorry, my time is almost up, but just as a kind of final question, given the enormity of the health risks, both known and, sort of, I guess, potentially unknown at this point, but suspected, should we be building more roads, or should we be really focusing on other, public transport solutions at this time? Is that cost-benefit analysis ever going to make sense for new roads?
Ms. Boyd, it's Mark Brook for the Lung Foundation. I don't think our foundation is committed to a zero net carbon future, first and foremost. But I don't think the foundation doesn't have a particular view about the balance of public infrastructure versus safety, other than to say we do need to take the safety of New South Wales citizens much more seriously, and not at the expense of public infrastructure that is damaging their health.
Ms. Goldman?
Very quickly, please.
Michelle Goldman from Asthma Australia. I would just say that we are behind other countries in the world, and we can take lessons from cities like London, who are implementing great measures to reduce the sources of pollution and protect the health of their citizens.
Thank you.
We'll now go to the government to take us to the 11 o'clock break. So we will throw to Mr. Franklin.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for being here today and for your, I think, very important contributions. I'd like to just have a couple of questions, if I may, around the submission from Lung Foundation Australia and Asthma Australia, also following up, I guess, from a little bit from Ms. Boyd's line of questioning. In your suggestions about what could be done, you really identify two fundamental areas. One is, I guess, structural issues that need to be done in terms of the building of these things, of tunnels and other infrastructure. And the other are cultural or behavioural issues, potentially, that we've touched on a couple of times through the questioning, which we could look at as well. I'd like to just discuss both of those. The first is, in terms of the structural issues, in terms of these sorts of projects around the world, and I understand you're not engineers, and I appreciate that, but do you know of any best practice for managing these sorts of issues, pollution, in these sorts of projects around the world that you can draw the attention of this committee towards, in terms of minimising the sorts of particulates and concerns that you have in terms of the infrastructure? We might start with you, Mr. Brook.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Franklin. We would need to take that question on notice. We are aware of significant policy frameworks in other countries, particularly European countries, which are guiding infrastructure development, and we're happy to provide that at subsequent to the hearing. But what I would respond to say is that we need to get the principles and the policy settings right first, and make sure that they're evidence-based. And as our submission clearly shows, getting those policy settings first and not as an afterthought. So to be frank, let's not build the infrastructure and then retrofit an air quality monitoring system. Let's have the conversation about the principles for setting air quality standards in this country first, and then look at the infrastructure. And that, I think that fundamental tenet of good planning needs to apply.
And that's obviously something the government's focused on. And I appreciate your comments, Ms. Goldman, about the clean air regulation passed recently. But did you have any other comments that you wanted to make about this issue?
No, I would endorse the comments of Mr. Brook, and only to say that in addition to finding examples, which we can certainly provide in terms of other areas in the world that have conducted infrastructure projects really well to minimise the level of emissions, I think the health impact assessment is undercooked. Usually that's been our observation, and so really important to do that thoroughly and rigorously to plan for things, even down to things like the number of cars or the number of vehicles, because you can estimate a vehicle volume that will pass through the tunnel, and it might be underestimated, and then despite all the calculations, you land up with greater emissions than you anticipated. So yeah, I think health impact assessments are critical based on the assumptions and measures put in place so that those assumptions aren't exceeded when the tunnel actually starts to operate.
Mr. Bridge, did you want to add anything in terms of world comparisons, or is that something that you don't have to, only if you wanted to?
No, again, I'd take that on notice if I could.
Please, that would be, and as I say, I know you're not engineers, but your perspective is, I think, useful in this discussion. Which brings me to the second issue, which is, of course, about cultural and behavioural issues and change. Obviously, some of those through the construction process, and I appreciate some of your specific suggestions in your submission, but obviously more broadly, as the world changes and more development happens, we need to consider these issues in terms of our behaviours. I guess I wanted to give you the opportunity to highlight those sorts of cultural and behavioural issues, particularly those that can be recommended by this committee or looked at by government in terms of assisting in that change that you particularly wanted to highlight to this committee today.
Mr. Frankler, there are several within the National Strategic Action Plan that we look for, including green vehicles and better public transport infrastructure. So mass movement as a modality is incredibly important going forward. But also looking, as I said, using artificial intelligence and digital technologies to drive personal behaviours around air quality. There will be people through bad luck that have a genetic predisposition to a lung disease, for example. So being able to preserve and protect their health is one of those fundamentals that the Lung Foundation and I would suggest Asthma Australia have been very strong on for many years, in being able to alert them to dangerous air quality levels. But I think there is also substantial work to be done in terms of public infrastructure policy and planning. So over the last 12 months as COVID has hit, we've observed seismic changes in, for example, the low levels of influenza brought about by cultural norms, things like mask wearing, people not shedding viral load, coming to work when they're sick. All of those lessons need to be applied, but over a much longer term. People working from home and understanding what people working from home does to the movements within major urban areas, people relocating out of, say, Sydney into Orange, for example, and working from home. All of those cultural behaviours are really interesting things that we aren't able, I'd suggest we're not able to fully quantify in terms of environmental policy going forward, but it would be a significant area of interest.
Ms. Goldman, did you want to add anything to that?
I would just endorse all of those comments and just say that the digital technology is a really important part in terms of adaptation strategies. So whilst we have high levels of pollution, enabling people to better understand the levels of pollution at any time, and also people who are more vulnerable to exposure, children, pregnant women, elder people, people with chronic diseases, to enable them to understand their exposure limits and when they need to take certain actions. So as part of the Air Smart campaign, it includes an app which will, over time, with people recording their symptoms, be able to provide personalised notifications to them so they understand at what level of air pollution exposure they're going to have respiratory symptoms and therefore be able to manage. That's part of the adaptation, but we also need to focus on the mitigation strategies. And I would just endorse the comments Mr. Brook made about green vehicles, public transport, and also limiting or moving away from diesel, because that's a major source of ultrafine particles.
One of the things I'm delighted about with the Beaches link is that it incorporates a new express bus service, which I think is a good thing for more public transport, as you say. Mr. Bridge, did you want to add anything finally?
Yes, there's a couple of points. Firstly, I'd like to endorse the comments made by the other two guests here. Additionally, though, I think there is a role to play in educating workforces when they're on projects like this in relation to their responsibility to help manage the emissions. And that's done through things like induction programs, through making everybody aware of their own responsibility to minimise the amount of pollution they're causing or releasing, or is being released as a result of their activities on the workplace. And that would be a major role then in reducing community exposures downwind of these sorts of sites. They do have a major role to play, and it can be a significant reduction just through their own personal actions taken on the workplace.
Right, thank you very much. They're my questions, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure if other members of the government have questions.
There's one more question available for government members if they so wish. Otherwise, we can draw this part of the hearing to a close. I think,
Is that Mr.
silence,
Chair?
perhaps.
No silence.
Ms.
Just trying to get through on the internet in region of New South Wales. No, I just wanted to, and I'm totally on board on the issue of air pollution. I'm an asthmatic myself, and appreciate the work you people do, really do. And my father's asthmatic as well. So that's quite a common disease in our society now. But I have a history of campaigning on the issue of the stacks. In the 1990s, over 2000, I campaigned against the Eastern Sydney stack built by Labor, unfiltered, quite a low one. And in fact, there's about 5 stacks that Labor built that aren't filtered, and then we came into government. When we came into government, the science was presented to us, and I got presented with it. I'm losing my breath already. And I just wanted you to comment, particularly maybe Ms. Goldman, around the policies we put in place since we came into government around the stacks. Now, just to remind you, there's now a license requirement. The EPA monitors it. The air quality is monitored for ambient air quality, and if they breach that, the license is suspended. It hasn't happened yet, but the science says that is a very good model, and that's our position at the moment. So, would you like to comment on that?
And then look, and that's the last question. Thanks. So over to you, Ms. Goldman.
I'd need to take that on notice. Based on the question, it sounds like it's definitely a move in the right direction. I know that whilst New South Wales has one of the most extensive air quality monitoring networks in the country, there still is room for improvement. And so it's also a question about whether there is adequate monitoring in all the communities that might be exposed to the emissions from those stacks, especially when weather events are extreme and the particles are being carried over larger distances. Because we know it's an issue that there's some communities who don't have appropriate air quality monitoring to understand air pollution levels.
Yeah, I mean, I'll conclude with this comment. I mean, the M5 was...
Sorry, Mr. Mallard, I'd invite the other witnesses to take the questions on notice. We are 1 minute past the expiration of government time. And I do want to give the Hansard and the Secretariat the break that has been promised. So thank you very much to the witnesses. You have taken questions on notice. You'll have 21 days to return an answer to receipt of the transcript. You are excused. And members, we will return at 11:15. I remind you to please turn off your video and your mute microphones unless you'd like to broadcast your going-ons on YouTube. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. We'll resume the hearings. I just ask that we admit our next set of witnesses, please. Wonderful, thank you, and welcome to our next set of witnesses who are joining us. There's welcome also to Mr. Veach, who's also from the upper house, who's also joining us for the second half of today's sessions. Can I just firstly check everyone's sound? Can you just nod if you can all hear us? And thank you. Miss Taylor, is your video working, or is your internet allowing you to broadcast video? Great, wonderful, thank you. And can I just quickly check your sound? If you can each unmute yourselves and just...
Reese Williams.
Right.
John Moratelli.
Meredith Foley.
Great. And Miss Taylor's still muted. Great. Okay, I'm just going to ask each of our witnesses now to state their name, position, and take either an oath or an affirmation as has been emailed to you by the Secretary.
My sound is working, thank you.
Thank you.
My sound is working, thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Taylor, given you're unmuted, we might start with you. If you don't mind stating your name and your position and taking either an oath or affirmation as has been emailed to you by the Secretariat.
Georgina Taylor.
And Ms. Taylor,
Georgina Taylor.
yes, can you please take an oath or an affirmation as has been emailed to you by the Secretariat? Would it help if I was to read it to you, Ms. Taylor?
Of course. Thank you very much, Chair and Committee, for allowing me to speak today. My name is Georgina Taylor. I provide technical support for the Anzac Park PNC, and I'm also a member of Registry Precinct. Sorry, of course. Yes. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Mr. Moratelli, do you mind stating your name and position and taking either an oath or an affirmation as has been emailed to you?
Yes, my name is John Moratelli. My position is President of the Willoughby Environmental Protection Association, but everybody calls it WEPA, and that's what I'll call it from here on, if that's all right. I'd like to take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Ms. Foley.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Meredith Foley. I'm on the Executive Committee for WEPA, and I will take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Williams.
Thank you. Reese Williams, Tunnel Coordinator, Anzac Park Public School PNC Association. I'll take the oath. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you very much. Can I invite each representative, well, each organisation to have one of their representatives please make a short opening statement, please?
We've agreed to allow Anzac Public School to go first, if that's all right.
Sure. Anzac Public School, or as Mr. Williams, feel free. Please limit it to no more than 3 minutes, please.
Yes, Chair. I'll be doing half the 3 minutes, and Ms. Taylor will be doing the second half. 798 and 120, 20,000 and 3,000. Good morning, committee members, and thank you for this opportunity. That's right, 798, 120, 20,000, 3,000. These figures relate to Anzac Park School, or APS, and the North Sydney Education District, the largest education district in the country. 798 and 20,000 are total numbers of children, and 120 and 3,000 are those children having special health needs, including asthma management plans. These are people who are outside those who can choose what happens, yet they are subject to those decisions. They need to be looked after, and courts have confirmed that obligation extends to government. APS is a new 1,100 capacity facility opened in 2016 with state-of-the-art, totally open, ambient air reliant 5-storey building. Other schools, whilst not new, have similar ambient air reliance. After some concerted communication from us, transport and contractors engaged with us and continue to do so on a regular basis. We have had some success there, but there are still concerns and we are not confident they will be met. Generally, any success has been with the contractors and not due to approval conditions or the government. Our concerns are the process is reactive, not proactive. Transport believes its tunnels will only slightly increase a currently poor air quality position, and that it is okay to deliberately increase air pollution at locations. The sometimes challenging and creative interpretation of the project underpinning documentation. No one on the proponent's side sees the overarching benefit filtration would have to the reduction of damaging air pollutants, climate change impacts, and meeting government targets. We need tighter, clearer, proactive terms ensuring protection during construction and in operation. Monitoring at schools and sporting places frequented by children now to provide a proper baseline data as well as ongoing perpetual monitoring. And lastly, filtration of the triple exhaust pollution stack at Camaray. As we have a moment with 6 to 18 months pause whilst the Warringah Freeway upgrade main works are designed, these issues can be addressed and fixed. I now hand over to Georgina Taylor, who will briefly add some aspects.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and committee members. Long urban road tunnels, that is those over 4 or 5 kilometres long, are rare worldwide and in Australia. Most are 500 metres and duck under a rail line or a road. Sydney has, however, approved 6 of them since 2014, with a deficient ventilation design before the first of those long tunnels even started operation. So there's been no real-world data to compare. They have designed them the same way as the short tunnels, which do not require filtration and can survive with just a stack at each end. Losing green space, many mature trees, which act as the lungs of an area, as happens on this project, and increased local road traffic, as is also shown in the EIS figures for the surrounding areas throughout the North Sydney and Willoughby LGAs, will make these pollution impacts worse. The recent history of ventilation and exhaust stack conditions in Sydney has been one of cherry picking the data and obfuscation. It's been apples comparing to oranges. Mr. Mallard rightly pointed earlier to the concern about exhaust stacks at the time of the Cross City Tunnel. That tunnel, however, is only 2.2 kilometres long. The projects this committee is looking at, the 7-kilometre plus Western Harbour Tunnel, connecting to a 7.5 to potentially 8-kilometre long by the time you get to Seaforth, Beaches Link Tunnel, are not the same thing at all. And they are treated quite differently overseas when these very rare long tunnels are built. North Connects, the 9-kilometre start of this list, has a better ventilation design than the Western Harbour Tunnel or the Beaches Link Tunnel. It does have air releases halfway along, so does not break the International Tunnel Design Rule that SETU, based in France, and PIAC, the Roads Association, subscribe to. Of no stack, there should never be a gap of more than 4.5 to 5,000 metres between exhaust stacks on a long road tunnel. These tunnels offend those principles. The word unfiltered is never mentioned in any of the glossy brochures or more than 20,000 pages of EIS documentation presented to the public for these projects. Instead, the words ventilation stack and world's best practice tunnel ventilation are used to cover over this. Why not use the word unfiltered? It's fine. It's safe on short tunnels. It isn't safe on these, but they don't tell the public that. Also, inaccurate description of overseas tunnel designs have been included in the technical papers provided to the Chief Scientist's ACTAC Air Quality Committee. The Hong Kong CWB tunnel referred to in the latest paper that they raced through in 2018-2019 at the time of the EIS is in fact filtered. They stated in the report, we couldn't tell if there was air treatment. The 18-kilometre E4 Stockholm tunnel referred to has 10 exhausts along its left, like Sydney Harbour Tunnel plus Sydney Harbour Tunnel plus Sydney Harbour Tunnel, a safe way to build it if you don't want to filter. The same independent expert has been used by the tunnel proponent for successive projects and placed on the ACTAC committee. I can provide specific detail on what they do worldwide on urban road tunnels of this nature if the committee likes afterwards or on notice. Many use either particle and gas filtration to remove exhaust before release. Others add a lot more stacks along the route, or be pragmatic like the French and the Turks and just ban diesel from the tunnels.
Ms. Taylor,
We
can
agree.
I ask you to please just come towards the end, please, so we can have the other witnesses make their statements.
Yes, yes. We agree with the Chief Scientist's ACTAC report of 2014, updated in 2018, that well-designed road tunnels, the emissions from these cause negligible change to surrounding air quality. However, that report was based only on data taken from the operating existing Sydney road tunnels, none of which exceed 4 kilometres. The federal government has not increased vehicle and fuel standards as was anticipated when these projects were proposed, and the Chief Health Officer's statement indicates that unless every single assumption in the modelling holds, the results will not be satisfactory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Taylor. Can I invite either Ms. Moratelli or Ms. Foley to make a statement on behalf of WEPA?
Thank you, Chair. I'm John Moratelli and I'll make the opening statement for WEPA. I'll also be seeking to table a document. I don't know if now is the appropriate time or at the end of my statement.
It's fine to table it now.
Okay, I seek to table the document described as tabled document, which has been provided to the committee and has the document called table document and 5 annexures, namely annexures A, B, C, D and E.
Thank you.
Okay. It is nothing short of disgraceful that the government has refused to consider alternatives to these motorway projects, the combined impact of which include the felling of over 3,000 mature trees, the disturbance of toxic sediment in Sydney and Middle Harbour, the disturbance of contaminated historical tips and landfill sites at Flat Rock Gully and Camaray Golf Course, the failure to properly assess and manage this contamination, which at Flat Rock may include PFAS, dioxins and hexavalent chrome, the movement of around 440,000 B-double trucks over the Sydney Harbour Bridge during construction, the generation of greater car traffic and pollution, the risk posed to local bushland by drawdowns, and more. All this for dubious benefits based on unjustified traffic modelling in the context of a refusal to consider any alternatives to motorways, a failure to consider the impact of recent public transport initiatives, such as the B Line, and a failure to consider the predicted impact of COVID-19 on population growth and travel patterns in particular. changes to travel patterns due to an increase in working from home. The way in which the Beaches Link EIS deals with the impact of COVID cannot be described as anything other than deceptive. Claimed travel time savings for the Beaches Link are based on projections which have nothing to do with historical patterns, but everything to do with designated growth areas, particularly French's Forest. The claimed savings when analysed do not represent savings on current travel times, but nowhere in the documentation, as far as we're aware, is this explicitly stated. Benefit cost calculations for the Western Harbour Tunnel have been done and contracts entered without any meaningful assessment of the cost of contamination management and remediation, despite major remediation being likely to be required at Flat Rock Gully and Camaray Golf Course. No benefit cost calculations have been done for the Beaches Link Tunnel, and Terry LaRue's submission suggests that such a calculation would result in a number less than 1. Again, the costs of the Beaches Link Tunnel haven't taken into account the major contamination remediation which will be required at Flat Rock Gully. To the extent that contamination assessments have been done, risks have been ignored or underplayed. In relation to management of contamination risks, DPIE, the relevant regulator, has failed to impose appropriate conditions of approval, ignored breaches of those which do apply, allowing work to proceed without any proper contamination assessment, and turned a blind eye to false and misleading statements in the EIS and DSIs, seemingly adopting a no penalty for porkies policy, despite penalties being provided for in the relevant legislation. DPIE has not committed to exhibiting the preferred infrastructure report for Flat Rock Gully, despite WEPA's requests. It shouldn't be like this. There are alternatives. WEPA has put forward an alternative to the Beaches Link Tunnel developed by Ted Nye, an experienced tunnelling engineer. It consists of an underground electric bus or light rail between French's Forest and Chatswood. It would be cheaper and have greater capacity than the current proposal without the environmental and health downsides. It and other alternatives need to be seriously before any further development of the current proposals take place. WEPA doesn't believe that, if this is done, the current Beaches Link proposal can survive. The current Western Harbour Tunnel proposal can then be reassessed in light of updated traffic modelling, which takes public transport developments such as the B line and the impact of COVID into account. If a motorway is still considered appropriate, alignments for the Western Harbour Tunnel, such as those proposed by Ted Nye, don't need to surface to meet up with the Beaches Link, can be considered. Such an alignment would avoid the additional expense and environmental risk of an immersed tube tunnel across Sydney Harbour and the bisection of North Sydney CBD. Should either of these projects proceed after an open consideration...
Please just come to the end of your statement.
Yes, I'm just finishing up. Should either of these projects proceed after an open consideration of alternatives and the benefit cost ratio of the different alternatives, they should only do so subject to more stringent mitigation measures such as those outlined in our submission. Thank you.
Thank you. I thank the witnesses for their extensive opening statements. If you'd be kind enough to please email them through to the Secretariat, that would be most appreciated. We will now kick off questionings with questions from the opposition. I might ask the first, and that's directed at you, Mr. Williams. Can you just describe the attitudes of the school community that you represent towards this project? And has the factors that you've identified led to them suffering from any greater apprehension about the project?
Rhys Williams. Thank you, Chair. The situation is the population of the school has been aware of what's been transpiring. We've been providing them with updates on what has been occurring. And I would say that with the current state of the early works in Anzac Park, which is adjacent to the school, with the chopping down of trees and things of that nature, it's become more real for them, and the concern which was there has heightened, and there's a lot more interaction with us as to what's happening, are we going to be looked after, what's happening with the pollution, and the fact that there is proposed to be the unfiltered pollution exhaust stacks, that is causing a lot of concern, which won't go away.
And Ms. Williams, you said that to the extent to which you are getting information, you are getting information from the contractor, not the government. Is that clear?
Well, what occurs is, sorry, Rhys Williams, what occurs is we have meetings which are now regular. We provide a list of concerns or issues, and the responses are discussed at the meetings. Now, the ones where we have got some success, which relate to traffic controls during the early works for trucks. So the trucks are restricted on when they can pass through the streets in front of the school. That was provided by the contractors, because at the meeting, which was also had planning there, planning indicated that there were absolutely no restrictions on the traffic. They could have whatever size trucks they wanted travelling at whatever time. But the contractors obviously decided that it was in their best interest to avoid running over children, so they agreed to reduction of the timing that they would have trucks going through those areas. And the other success we've had is in relation to, very recently, the works have required signage, illuminated signage, to be placed on streets for traffic to be diverted. And what was occurring was that the trucks that had the illuminated signs were maintaining the engines on the whole day, not turning them off. And parents were concerned about that issue. We addressed the contractors on that, and we reached agreement that they would not do that, and they would provide the batteries so the signs could be illuminated without the trucks being on.
Thank you. And look, my final question before I pass to my colleague, which would probably be Mr. Veach, I think has a question, is aside from the contact that you've been having with the contractor, you made reference to contacts you've had with Transport for New South Wales or DPIE or other arms of the government, including its political representatives. Are you confident that you are having adequate levels of engagement directly with Transport for New South Wales or other arms of the government about your school community's concerns?
Rhys Williams, yes, because the arrangements presently are that the Transport and contractors meet monthly with our school principal and quarterly with the PNC. So yes, we have regular contact.
Thank you very much. Mr. Veach.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are essentially to Mr. Moratelli for the group that we're referring to as WEPA. Mr. Moratelli, I've just been reading through the table documents you provided to the committee today, or been received by the committee today. Can I guess my questions relate to Camaray Golf Club and Flat Rock Gully. What do you think was the adequacy of consideration around alternative options and how and the measuring of the impact on those two sites?
Right, dealing with the adequacy of consideration of alternative options first, it's fairly obvious from the documents that we've received, particularly Mr. Nye's Gibber application, that there were never any alternative options considered. The riding instructions given to the RMS were to consider a motorway option and no other option. By way of background, Mr. Nye's Gibber application had sought documents justifying some assertions made in the Beaches Link EIS around the feasibility of a rail link. And initially he received a response saying, oh, well, this is covered in the strategic business case, which at the time was for both projects. And that was kept in confidence, you can't have it. When he appealed that to NCAT, it was reviewed and he got a response back saying, oh, so we've got that wrong. It had nothing to do with strategic business case, because all the strategic business case considered was a motorway option. And so given that it considered a motorway option, what you're saying about the rail option, in fact, there wasn't any consideration given to it at all. It wasn't in the strategic business case. Options weren't, other non-motorway options weren't considered. So that's basically what that's about. And so other options haven't been considered at all. In relation to contamination issues and management of them, particularly at Flat Rock Gully, which has contamination going down, according to the field, going down at least to 50 metres. It was a massive regional tip. It operated for many, many years. Towards its top, there was the Hallstrom refrigeration factory, which at its peak was producing 1,200 refrigerators a week, and probably there was chrome plating going on there. Chrome plating generates hexavalent chrome, generates PFAS chemicals. There was open burning going on in that tip, and there are photos of that. That was generating probably dioxins due to the burning of plastics. There's extremely serious contamination issues there. Willoughby City Council has notified the EPA pursuant to Section 60 of the Contaminated Land Management Act in relation to contamination of groundwater. That's the same, so that's the same water table that these tunnels will be going through. That is still under assessment, that notification. Dr. Haley, which I've mentioned in my tabled document, says that the groundwater assessment done in the EIS is not best current practice. And it's a real concern that the Hallstrom refrigeration factory, being a massive, really a very large industrial undertaking, and its contaminants were never identified in the EIS as a potential contaminant, despite, excuse me holding this up, it's just referred to. This is the Bob McKillop book, which is the local history of the tip, referred to in the EIS as a source. It has pages and pages in there on the Hallstrom refrigeration factory, and the Hallstrom refrigeration factory and its potential contaminants are never mentioned in the EIS. And that's a real concern, because what the EIS is supposed to do, it's supposed to do a thorough identification of potential contaminants, because then those contaminants have to be tested for and assessed. If it doesn't identify thoroughly the potential contaminants, they're not necessarily looked for. Now,
sorry,
yeah,
Mr.
so just to sum up, I think it's an extremely complex contamination situation. Also added to the fact that it feeds into Middle Harbour, and also added to by the fact that it's a massive water catchment. Flat Rock Gully is the water catchment, one of the biggest water catchments on the North Shore, possibly the biggest. Its water catchment is huge. It is a massive collection of water.
Thank you, Mr. Moratelli. Can I invite you to put any further detail you'd like to on notice, because we're now in the crossbench time, and I'd like to go to Boyd.
I can.
Ms. Boyd.
Thank you. And apologies for cutting you off, Mr. Moratelli. It's I think we could all talk about this all week and still only just get a little bit of the details that we need in order to assess this project properly. I will just direct my first question to Ms. Taylor. We're being told that, living with COVID in the future is going to mean, for example, keeping windows open and having quite good ventilation in our schools. I think schools have been, pretty advanced when it comes to understanding the impacts of air pollution. We've got the Idle Off campaign. People are being encouraged not to keep their engines on when they're waiting for their kids outside schools. If you had to close the windows because of construction dust and dangers in your particular school, how would you also be able to have a COVID safe school? Is that practically possible?
Thank you, Ms. Boyd. I think it's a problem for most of the schools across the area, and we're talking 20,000 students, largest education precinct in the country. But particularly for Anzac Park School, which is a lovely state-of-the-art facility for which the community is very grateful. The Smiling Kids feature on the local member, the Premier's website. She hasn't deemed to come and speak to them or their parents at all about this project. In answer to an earlier question by Mr. Mookie on engagement by MPs, etc. There is a real problem there because there are no air conditioning systems. It's devised for passive ventilation, which would be ideal in times of COVID. It has an atrium through the middle of the block. It's not roofed. If you're going to absolutely protect it from pollutants, you would really need to cover that over, put air conditioning in every classroom, and of course that doesn't account for the outdoor play space. Anzac Park doesn't just operate from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. It has an extensive out of school care provision. Again, a modern school doing this to avoid the double drop-offs, etc. So there are children on site there from 7:30 every morning until to 6 p.m. at night, outdoors. It does make it very difficult. And one reason why we're particularly concerned that we've been told there won't be on-site air quality monitoring at the school, certainly not in this baseline period. And for construction, Transport has told us, the project team, that a monitor will be put at the construction site. You know, maybe they'll give some warning of the silica dust that Mr. Bridge talked about, but it won't show what is the impact of what is actually landing at the schools. On WestConnex, there were monitors put at schools at St. Peter's and Haberfield, I understand. So we, have no exact baseline data. In the GRAL analysis and sensitive receivers shown in the EIS, they did go and do spot analysis near Camaray Public School to the north and Winona to the south, Neutral Bay to the west. Didn't come and put one at the school the closest to the site. We have the joys of public schools principals not being able to speak out because they are state government employees, so the burden falls on the PNCs or the parents and friends at Catholic schools. It does make it very difficult. The other point in relation to COVID is research out of the UK, which of course has unfortunately had far more COVID cases than the good management in Australia and New South Wales until the current outbreak, that people do worse with COVID where there is significant air pollution. Understandably, it's a disease of the lungs. And you heard all about lung diseases earlier on.
Absolutely. Thank you. So from a practical perspective, then, if we are looking at approval of a project on the basis that we can mitigate the air pollution impacts on children, the really high numbers of children in impacted areas, that's just not really going to. I mean, if you got a warning that there was, as you say, silica, what would you do? You'd have to presumably send them home.
We have asked for warnings to be done. Actually, that was in submissions that were made on the EIS, that, if there was an exceedance coming through the exhaust stack or something like that during operation, could there be an alarm or a hotline to the principal? All that was dismissed. The greatest mistrust, I think, of the process is that in the government then response to all the EIS submissions, in relation to the concerns on air quality, they simply repeat the line that the chief scientist committee report says that emissions from well-designed road tunnels create a negligible impact on background air pollution, but that report is founded on the data from the existing short Sydney road tunnels. They have not gone forward to what is done overseas, and where they've done that as a technical paper, there's errors in it. And in fact, the response that then came through to the EIS on Western Harbour Tunnel, after having spruiked that Stockholm's was also unfiltered, Transport responded and said simply back to the Department of Planning, well, the E4 Stockholm's not mentioned in the EIS, despite the fact they'd included it in little technical papers people could pick up at the display, and so ignored the issue, wouldn't engage with the point that things are done differently overseas. You know, we could hermetically seal all the classrooms and put air ventilators on. I would submit that should be the bare minimum that is done if they proceed with the current design.
Which of course increases the cost of the project.
And would seem to be more expensive than putting filters on the stack, but they've never obtained quotes for doing that.
Thank you.
As far as we can tell.
If I could turn to you, Mr. Moratelli, thank you so much for WEPA's really extensive submission. There's a lot of detail in there and it's incredibly useful. One thing that we haven't talked much about in this inquiry so far is the impact on Aboriginal heritage. Are you able to talk us through impacts on Aboriginal heritage in your area?
I might flick to Meredith Foley for that. That's all right.
Thanks, John. Thank you for that question. We're aware that the Flat Rock Gully area and right across the footprint for the construction, there are a large number of Indigenous sites. 29 sites will be impacted, including the tunnel will run right underneath the Western Harbour Tunnel will run right underneath the Whale Rock at Bull's Head. We know that Flat Rock Gully has had occupation from at least 6,000 years ago, and that there are sites there are what are known as potential archaeological deposits in that site, which may be impacted by the flushing of water during the construction down Flat Rock Creek. There are also likely to be, according to the Metropolitan Land Council, there's likely to be large numbers of undiscovered sites, particularly in Flat Rock Gully and also at Clive Park, where they may be submerged. There's local knowledge of submerged fish traps in that area and also of rock shelters which have been submerged. We don't know what the impact of placing the very large cofferdam close to those sites is going to be, but we are very concerned about vibrations and the impact that might have on the shelters and the rock formations, and also the impact, as I said before, of the water coming down through Flat Rock Gully. I mean, and just to make that a short statement, our concern has been that there needs to be archaeological expertise on site. It's not enough to give the contractors a short course. They're not going to recognise these sites necessarily.
Thank you.
Could I just add to that in terms
Sorry,
of...
Mr. Moratelli, again, if you have any additional detail, please put it on notice, because we have limited time and the rest of the time is the government's. So is that to you, Mr. Franklin, or Mr. Faraway?
Mr. Mallard, I think it is, Mr. Mookie.
Mr. Mallard, sure.
Yes, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you for your submission and your evidence to the inquiry. And I don't think there's a lot I can add to the conversation. We're pretty clear what your position is on the project. Can I just ask you collectively, and you can answer individually, obviously you're a critic of the project, but also of the EIS. Did you make submissions in the EIS process along the way?
Yes, we did. We certainly pointed out the failings in terms of the proper assessment of contamination at Flat Rock Gully. And in that regard, I really want to emphasise that the preferred infrastructure report that I think has largely been generated from our concerns. I have a real concern. I've mentioned this in our document, that preferred infrastructure report may not be exhibited. In other words, the people who brought to the attention of the regulator the potential problems, the serious problems with contamination and other issues, may not get to see how that is responded to and comment on Transport for New South Wales' response as part of the decision-making process. And I think that's not acceptable.
Okay.
Chair, may I make one comment on biodiversity in the impacted by this these projects? We're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis. We're seeing animal species crashing around us. They're part of the web of our lives. We have, and the environmental impact assessment just failed to look at the full biodiversity in those areas. It only went to the letter of the law and looked at a couple of threatened species. And frankly, the mitigations that were suggested were risible in some cases. And I say this from a background of having worked with the Environment Protection Association for a period of years.
And could I just add in terms of the EIS, that some of the claims there are straight out deceptive. The one made in the Beaches Link Tunnel EIS about the impact of COVID, saying that traffic levels have returned to pre-COVID levels without taking into account the fact that public transport patronage has dropped off a cliff, is straight out deceptive in the context of the EIS. And I'm surprised, and I know that Terry LaRue has actually requested DPIE to look at prosecuting Transport for New South Wales for breach of Section 10.6 of the Environmental Protection and Assessment Act in relation to making false and misleading statements. And they have not been prepared to do it. And given that planners rely so much on the honesty of the proponents, their refusal to take any steps when false or misleading statements have been pointed out, and we've pointed out some other ones which I could go into, I think is really concerning.
Mr. Mallard, I'd say in terms of the view of the school, there'd be a mixed view as to where some people who are happy with the infrastructure projects, some who aren't. As you will have seen from the submission, it's not saying, yes, there's concerns, you should have looked at other options, but it was presented as a road project. It is a road project. It just is that it actually be delivered properly. And the fact of a triple, because the pollution stack at Camaray will vent all the northbound Western Harbour Tunnel, the North Sydney leg, as well as the Camaray through main leg, and the main line from the Beaches Link Tunnel, with no filtration or mitigation measures, is quite astonishing. That is now the biggest proposed stack on the motorway network. That, I think, is what has incredibly astounded people. That will be 42.5 kilometres of pollution coming out. Part of the reason for the problem is, understandably, the state government thought the federal government would have fixed the vehicle emission standards by now. They didn't do it. There is a document that we will be sending as supplementary position where the ACTAC committee almost begged the federal government to please get those standards in.
Yeah.
And we also know that with the end of the car industry here, the tariffs were removed from second-hand vehicles being sent to Australia. That also will extend the life of the more polluting vehicle fleet here, particularly delivery vehicles, with which there is a very strong second-hand market in Australia.
Yeah.
It's not so much the problem of the big truck companies who buy the latest schmick one, they keep on selling their vehicles, and they often have a life of 30 years plus.
I'm,
That's the pollution load.
if you heard the evidence earlier from the, is that the chair? Sorry, was it the chair?
No, it's Rhys Williams. I was just going to answer your question.
Oh, sorry. Yep. I
Yes.
didn't realise there was
The
four.
question whether submissions were made. Just to answer that question, yes, submissions were made by the PNC to both the Western Harbour Tunnel and Beaches Link.
And if you heard my questioning earlier of the Asthma Foundation, and I think we're on a unity ticket about air quality. I grew up in Western Sydney. I live out in the mountains now, but I know all about the pollution, the two-day-old pollution winds out in Western Sydney, the higher levels of lung issues for kids and that out in Western Sydney. And so I'm really sympathetic to that. I mean, one small light at the end of the tunnel is, of course, this government's a big advocate for EVs and changing over the state government fleet and bus fleet to electric vehicles. And I guess over a period of time, that'll help improve the air quality as well. But I know it's not a solution.
The estimates are it will take 30 years, which is many generations of the lives of these kids, unfortunately.
1990 seems like yesterday to me, so 30 years is all relative, isn't it?
Not for a primary school kid.
But there are other alternatives that wouldn't cause the pollution at all, such as...
I heard your evidence. Yeah. And I mean, and I just want to put on the record, I mean, I'm the Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure, that, I'm very proud of this government being balanced in its approach to transport. So, yes, we're building long overdue connecting major roads, very important for the economy, but also we're putting a lot of money, almost dollar for dollar, into public transport. So for the North Shore, of course, is the metro line and the separate harbour crossing, and the B double buses up, the buses up to the northern beaches. I know you'd rather see probably more rail in that regard, but you do acknowledge that there is, more than any government in the past, a balancing act going on between roads and public transport in New South Wales.
Look, I acknowledge that there. Look, I think the Chatswood to Sydenham line is a fantastic piece of infrastructure. The thing that amazes me, though, is that given that it's going to whisk you from Chatswood to Martin Place in 11 minutes and to Barangaroo in 9 minutes, and given that the congestion is worse along the Warringah Road corridor, and given that the population growth on the northern beaches is occurring around French's Forest, why you're not looking at a Warringah Road connection before the Beaches Link tunnel is decided on? It's on the face of it, and on Ted Nye's work, it appears to be far more cost effective, have a lot more capacity, and it's cheaper and doesn't have any of these environmental downsides. I just don't know why the government's not considering it.
Is that in your submission to us? Sorry, I'm not.
Yes, it is. It's in the here's alternatives. Yeah. And the other thing is about the Beaches Link tunnel.
I apologise to interrupt there again. But we do have our next set of witnesses waiting. We are running slightly over time.
Always cutting.
Mr. Mallard, okay. The alternative interpretation is I always give you an extra minute. But either way, I do thank our witnesses on this panel who have joined us. You have taken numerous questions on notice, and you will have 21 days to return the answers after you receive the transcript from the Secretariat. Thank you for joining us. You are excused, and can we please welcome our next set of witnesses? Thank you. We're just waiting for Mr. Williams to depart. Mr. Williams, from the previous session, if you are able to just leave, that'll be helpful for Hansard. Thank you very much. And thank you. I welcome our next set of witnesses. Starting with, firstly, can I just check that you can all hear us?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Yep. And we can all hear you. Wonderful.
Yes, thank you.
So can I just ask each witness to state their name and position, and if possible, take either the oath or affirmation as has been emailed to you. And I would like to start with Ms. Williams.
Louise Williams, Public Officer, Baringabush Residents Group. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And Ms. Collins.
Thank you. Anne Collins, Manly Dam Liaison Officer, Baringabush Residents Group. And I was going to take the oath. Do I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help me God.
Thank you. And Ms. Hoy?
Thank you, Chair. Sandy Hoy, Special Projects, Northern Beaches Secondary College, Balgala Boys Campus Parents and Citizens Association. I'll take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Cardwell.
Hello, my name is Colin Cardwell. I'm the president of the Northern Beaches Secondary College, Balgala Boys Campus, P&C Association. I'll take the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. I'm going to invite one representative of each organisation to make a short opening statement of no more than 3 minutes. Which organisation would like to go first?
I'm happy for you guys to go first.
Okay. Thank you. Can one representative of your association please go first?
Yes, so just go ahead.
Yep.
Okay. Louise Williams, Baringabush. It's easy to like the idea of the Beaches Link Tunnel if you don't realise what it will really cost. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I represent the Baringabush Residents Group, and we're a coalition. We are part of a coalition of local community groups that connects about 5,000 families across Seaforth and Balgala and beyond. And Anne is our link within the coalition to save Manly Dam. The Beaches Link Tunnel impacts some stunningly beautiful and environmentally unique parts of Sydney. That these otherwise protected areas can be enjoyed today is largely thanks to the past efforts of individuals, communities and governments who recognise their enduring worth. Across the project, at least 40 threatened species will be affected, or even in our area, locally extinguished, as thousands of trees are felled, as our suburbs and creeks are dried up, as groundwater is drawn down and as Middle Harbour is dredged. Take, for example, the permanent loss of up to 96% of the water flow in Burnt Bridge Creek that runs from Seaforth along a lovely riparian corridor teeming with life to the ocean at Manly, or the fate of the New South Wales mainland's last 23 breeding pairs of fairy penguins that forage in Middle Harbour, and that will, according to the EIS, be at risk of hearing loss, or the proposed retention ponds above Manly Dam that would have failed multiple times this year based on rainfall data, washing contaminants into Sydney's largest swimmable freshwater lake. There are so many details like these. However, I think what emerged from the voluminous EIS was one overarching theme, and that is that the most significant risk lies in rushing this project through. This was confirmed when we obtained independent expert reports commissioned by DPI and tabled today. They concluded Transport for New South Wales did not use best practice nor the most recent data in assessing the risk to sensitive groundwater, freshwater and marine waters across the project footprint, and that multiple additional studies are needed. In the media today, Transport for New South Wales compared the forecast deterioration in water quality in Middle Harbour after the tunnel's been constructed to what occurs after heavy rainfall. But we can't swim after heavy rainfall in Middle Harbour or in Manly Dam, and this effect would be every day, not intermittently. This is, of course, just one example. Across the project, numerous risks have not been adequately addressed, particularly for issues like air quality and for traffic flow. And this really matters. The community is well aware that any compliance conditions imposed by DPI can be appealed by contractors directly to the Minister with no option for public consultation or legal challenge. And I suppose the underlying question is why rush? Over half of the Northern Beaches worked within the LGA even before COVID. And this week, the Productivity Commission forecast a long-term shift towards work from home and away from the daily commute. At the same time, every level of government is spruiking the benefits of getting people out of cars to address congestion and reduce emissions. And last month, Infrastructure Australia warned that road congestion cannot be efficiently relieved through the continued expansion of road capacity. In fact, it seems there's never been a better time to not rush through a $14 billion toll road conceived over a decade ago, and in promising better access to the Northern Beaches, risks degrading the very livability and environment that draws people to this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I invite a representative of Mr. Garble, if you wish to speak, or Ms. Hoy?
Yes, I'll speak. Thank you. Colin Cardwell. The Northern Beaches Secondary College, Balgala Boys Campus, or Bally Boys as we know it, has a fascinating recent history. Only 10 years ago, it would have been polite to suggest that its reputation was average. Last year, it was second in the state for English. That's right, a non-selective state boys high school was second in the state for English. Over the last 10 years, it has become the Department of Education's poster child for secondary education, especially for boys. The outstanding academic results, along with similar achievements in sport, music, art and drama, have rightly transformed the reputation of the school. A big shout out for the principal and his team. But it's not all good. In 2022, the student population of the school will be around 1,340. The school is designed to accommodate around 700, maybe 800 students at most. Even with only 800 students, the state of the school would get an F. It's poorly maintained with very little outdoor space. With 1,340 students, it really is at breaking point. Now add in 2 years of the disruption that COVID has brought, and you have a community of children, teachers and parents who are under a tremendous amount of stress. A good education is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The Bally Boys P&C does not have a position on whether the tunnel should go ahead or not. We just know that if it does go ahead, we cannot and must not allow the children and teachers of Bally Boys to experience any more stress. The EIS has clearly identified a range of impacts on the school. The Balgala Golf Course construction support site with a ventilation outlet and a wastewater treatment site will be located directly across the road from the school. The impacts that we see on the students, teachers and staff at the school will include truck traffic, disruption access, noise, vibration, poor air quality and health impacts, and a loss of access to the small amount of open space that we have at Balgala Oval. We're not experts. There could be other impacts that we can't foresee. And of course, other schools in the area, including Seaforth Public and Cecilia's Primary School, will also be affected. We estimate that around 2,200 Bally Boys and their families, teachers and other staff would be directly affected during the 6 or more years construction period. Unless something is done, the education of a whole generation in the lower Northern Beaches area could be ruined. Impacts have been identified, but the problem we've got is there is no plan in place to address them. We're sure there's a lot that could be done to mitigate and offset the impacts, but this needs independent expertise that is focused on the needs of the school to create a plan that will work for all the stakeholders. Once an agreed plan has been put in place, it will take time to implement if we're going to do that without further impacting the school through the process. With the planned start date of less than 2 years away, what we're asking here today is that this project be paused until a plan can be agreed upon and implemented. For the sake of the children and the teachers and the school staff, this needs to be done right. And to support this opening statement, we'd also like to table a presentation that we've sent through as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can each of the representatives please just email through your opening statement to the Secretariat? It will just assist Hansard to properly record it. We will now kick off with questioning to the opposition, and I might just kick off some questions first to you, Ms. Williams. You're making reference to, I guess, some public statements that were made this morning by Transport for New South Wales in response to, I think, was it a GIPRA application undertaken by your group, or?
It was undertaken by the Coalition of Community Groups. So we have, our group is Seaforth, there's Balgowlah. The application was actually the Balgowlah Residents Group, and the response was in the Sydney Morning Herald this morning. So it didn't come through to us.
And in response, Transport for New South Wales described this project as having minimal impacts on surrounding groundwater, creeks and seawater. Do you agree with them?
Well, I'm not in a position to agree or disagree. What I'm in a position to do is read the statements by the experts that were commissioned by the Department of Planning, and those documents have been sent to all of you. And they say that the assessment has been inadequate. I think one of the most telling things was in the EIS. It talked about a 96% reduction in flow in an entire catchment. And then it just sort of flippantly said, well, there'll be feasible and reasonable mitigation measures. Now, I write those sort of documents, professionally. And as a scientific or technical term, feasible and reasonable is subjective and tells you nothing. So that, I guess that's my biggest concern, is that we are going ahead in a very, very beautiful and sensitive area that belongs to everybody on a promise. And we don't know what those mitigation measures will be, how they will work, what they will cost. And for somewhere like Burnt Bridge Creek, it might be kind of I'll be quick, an interesting case study. The voters of the then Manly Council area paid an environmental levy to have this area looked after and rehabilitated. It's got a walking track and it's the bike track to Manly. One of the trees that's going to be cut down even has its own Instagram page. This is a much loved area, and it also hosts an endangered flying fox colony. So our concern is, as others have said, that we don't oppose a tunnel per se. What we're really concerned about is we don't know how and if this creek will be protected, and we will have no further opportunity to discuss that with anybody. We just have to believe that contractors will look after it.
And just to be clear, when you're talking about the experts, you're referring to the University of New South Wales specialists who are hired by Department of Planning?
Yes. And you might note in the UNSW document that specialists said that the treatment of Burnt Bridge Creek within the EIS was just flatly unacceptable.
So in terms of what your call for action is, you're calling for, is it more transparency around these particular issues, or are you calling for a mitigation strategy, or both?
I think that, as many of the other speakers have mentioned, that for the impacts in our area, the work hasn't been done yet. You can't ask people to support or oppose a project if they can't understand what the impacts will be. So, we've got part of the story, and then we've got things like negligible, feasible, reasonable, if convenient. We don't know how our area will be looked after and whether it will or not. And we also know full well that compliance conditions can be appealed and overturned. So go on.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to ask my next question to the school representative. So if there was anything further you'd like to add, then I'll... So I'm just going to ask one question to the school representatives before I invite my colleague, if he has any questions, to go. I understand you're calling for a pause for the project for the development of the plan. But can you describe what level of interaction have you had with the government, Transport for New South Wales, or the contractor, that would allow your school community to have confidence that its concerns are being addressed?
Yeah, Colin Cardwell here. So we have had one meeting so far with the project team, and we've tried to put the case to them that we need to spend some time putting a plan together, and that needs some of its own funding. I think that the challenge has been, of course, though, that the response we've really had is it's all going to be fine, it's all going to be okay. but without having somebody focus on that from the school's perspective, it's very difficult to have any confidence in that. We have a number of stakeholders. Some of the solutions might involve the dismantled golf club across the road, and of course that's council land. Some of the road issues and transport issues locally will involve the council. There's the Department of Education, there's the school itself. And so there's a lot of stakeholders involved that all need to be brought together to try and find a solution that will mean that there's a net zero impact on the buoys.
But again, Ms. Hoy, if you've anything you wish to add, but have you actually had the opportunity to speak to Transport for New South Wales or your local member or anyone else who is actually from the government and not from the project team about addressing your concerns?
Sandy Hoy, Colin has been involved with discussions with the local state members, so I'll pass on to Colin to answer that.
Yeah, we've had one meeting with James Griffin, and again put this case forward to him, and I think it was through him that the initial conversation with the project team has come about. Although, I mean, it's a clear demonstration here that we spoke to him. That would have been back in May, and then the initial meeting was 3 months later. This all takes a long time, and to do a thorough process is going to take time. And so our issue is not, per se, the tunnel as such, but about doing it right. And to do it right is going to take time.
Thank you. Mr. Veach.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to probably Ms. Williams from the Baringa Bush Residents Group. In your earlier responses to some questions, you were talking about the fairness, the reasonableness, and I think the word was feasible and reasonable mitigation methods. Can I just ask you how you would rate the communication with the agencies around just what that mitigation might look like?
Well, it's been zero, absolutely zero. You know, you just keep getting, it's almost like, you know, we're a group of about 5,000 families across this area, and we've got a lot of professional expertise in the group. People have asked for, you know, why wasn't there an air quality monitor there? Why wasn't there this? Why? And we just keep getting referred back to the EIS. So as a group, we've had absolutely zero contact with Transport for New South Wales, except for the one-way video sort of, I guess they were briefings at Christmas when the Northern Beaches was in lockdown. So, you know, we're all used to being online now, but this is, you know, feels a bit for the community like an ambush, because this entire thing is being pushed through in COVID circumstances where the community can't meet, where we can't go and talk to people. We've had a couple of meetings with Department of Planning, which have been very, what could you say, cards very close to the chest. I don't know, Anne, have you got anything else you could add to that, if you don't mind me throwing to my colleague?
Thanks, Louise. Anne Collins from Manly Dam. Probably in terms of consultation, no, very, very little. And I think the difficulty is that you look at the reports, and we've had to GIPA to get further information on many of these reports. And the difficulty, even if we look at the DPIE, the E group, Environment, EES group, they've have concerns about the depth of knowledge in the coverage and the environmental impacts, and have asked for some things to be redone. So have like the Bitsios traffic, so have even Northern Beaches Council, despite their commentary the other day, their submission has a very large number of concerns about the environmental impacts and also about the traffic impacts. And so they might well be in discussions with Transport for New South Wales, but none of the very well researched reports that have been put through to either the EIS or the parliamentary inquiry have had follow-up processes.
Thank you very much, Ms. Collins. Opposition time has expired, so it's over to Ms. Boyd for crossbench time.
Thank you. I'll just pick up on that line of questioning in relation to this EIS. So I guess firstly, to Baringa Bush Residents Group, this is as I understand it, you sort of came together in order to share the burden of understanding this EIS in order to actually be able to contribute meaningfully in the process of a consultation. How much time did you have between when you sort of first found out about it and when you were expected to make a submission? And did you ask for an extension at any time?
Yes, like as did many of the schools. This came out just before, obviously, just before Christmas during the COVID lockdown on the northern beaches, with a large number of schools profoundly affected. It was also, I imagine, a absolutely terrifying surprise to Balgowlah boys that the stack and the works had been moved up the street across the road. So we're in a situation where we weren't able to talk to each other. We weren't able to move around. We weren't even, able to leave our area. And we were supposed to respond to this. And we went to ministers. We went, as a coalition, not separately. A long list of school PNCs, Catholic Schools Association, community groups. We're a community group that's registered with the council. We have that sort of format in our area. So we have a network of community groups that also meet with the council. The council asked as well. So, look, it is very stressful to suddenly find your world is going to change during a sort of COVID lockdown.
I can
Can
imagine.
I just add? I think Anne Collins, one of the tricky bits was that so all the experts were then busy themselves looking at the report because we all had the same time to look at it. So you couldn't actually contact Northern Beaches Council to talk to their environmental people about the impact on your area because they were busy doing their own report. And so they actually put their report in before we'd even seen it as part of the community. And so our community groups put together a webinar, of which there were, like, we bought a license for Zoom, gave us 500 people. We oversubscribed that. We gave people, like, I don't know, about 5 days notice that it was on, and it was packed. So that's an indication of people's interest in that in that situation.
Thank you. I think, Ms. Williams, when you started at the beginning of your opening statement, and you said it's easy to like the idea of the beaches linked tunnel if you don't understand the true costs, and I think that's summing up a lot of the perhaps the vibe of a lot of the submissions that we have received. I just wanted to talk to you about the benefits and the costs in your particular area. And particularly, I noticed in your submission, you talk about how there are, for example, parts of French's Forest that are predicted to actually end up more congested than before the tunnel. What are the actual benefits to the area?
Look, I don't know if both of us can answer. I think that, where we are, we're in Seaforth, so the traffic will be 16% slower around Balgowlah and 10% slower on Wakers Parkway based on the EIS. We're not making those numbers up because the tunnel is not really yet integrated into the local road system. So you'll have traffic slowing down on approach. So from a traffic point of view, there don't seem to be any benefits for this particular area. Which I don't think is really well understood. The other thing is that we've had great success with the B-line bus, increasing people's experience of public transport. Public transport is very popular, and we don't yet know how this is going to play out. What traffic on the Spit Bridge is local going to school, what's commuting, how many people will work from home. We suggest that it will be very popular on the Northern Beaches because unfortunately we are famously the insular peninsula, we like staying where we are. And I think probably a very key point for the Northern Beaches is that we're an interesting area. We're conservative economically and socially, but we have a very, very high regard for our natural environment. And that possibly could be, seen in that the only time we've ever not voted for the Liberal government has been over environmental issues. And so the environment is really precious, and a lot of people have invested a lot of love in that, you know, bush regeneration, and, you know, they really care about their echidnas and all of their other, and their flying foxes. And you probably know more from Manly Dam's point of view.
Oh, are you on mute? Sorry. Anne Collins, Manly Dam. Yeah, I think it's a difficult one to talk about the benefits. So we're promised that we have that we'll be getting travel savings, and that seems to be the major thing that we're promised, and that's what people think. Oh, I hate sitting in traffic, so if I get some savings, that would be great. But I think that people haven't been sold the whole story, and even the concept of where it now takes 35 minutes to get into town from Balgala, and then we're going to be saving 38 minutes to get to town to Balgala is sort of weird, because I'm going to get young in the process. So the other benefits of it might well be for large industry to come through with the trucks and freight that will then be allowed to come, and more the benefits to have more people coming through on the weekends and during the week and so forth. And I don't think that's been sold to the Northern Beaches people in any way, shape or form. And I think there's huge, the costs are huge.
I note also in your submission, you talk about, quote, a majority support for public transport options, sort of end quote. Can you tell us on what basis you claim there to be a majority support in?
That was from a survey that was done, and it divided the seat of Warringah up into the different wards, and the only part of that ward that had an over 50% support for the tunnel per se was Mossman, and the other areas, Balgala and Seaforth and Manly, preferred public transport.
Was it by a lot?
Pre-COVID. Yeah, it was around 30. I'm just trying to think.
I know.
Yeah, I'd have to send it to you if that's okay. Do you know, Anne, have you got that survey?
I've got it, but I can't put my fingers on that. If we can take that one on notice, that would be great.
Yeah, that would be great. So in your view, do you think that this project will actually reduce congestion on the roads in the long term?
Well, personally, I don't, because having lived in a number of international cities with lots of cars, putting more people in more cars doesn't reduce congestion. Putting more people in fewer vehicles does. So, you know, I'm not an expert. I just think it's logical. You know, and that's what Infrastructure Australia said. I think it was only last week. You can't alleviate congestion just by building more roads. So I feel like we have a golden opportunity now to try some of those light touch options, like really analysing our traffic and seeing, do we have local traffic that's on the Spit Bridge that could be taken off through better school buses? But what in fact happened at Christmas as well, when the EIS was dropped, our bus services were reduced. And have you got any more to say on that?
I think that, yeah, Anne Collins, sorry, Manly Dam, the congestion on the roads will be huge, and I think the Northern Beaches submission highlights that in a huge way. They've actually asked Transport for New South Wales to look at a whole range of local intersection as a result, and so does the BITSIOS independent report that's been done on the local traffic implications. And so simplistically, the amount of traffic that comes from Sydney Road onto the onto the Spit Bridge now is like 55% of the actual like what goes there, and all of that is going to get shoved through that little windy road that goes past the golf course and then into the tunnel. So right outside the school, at Maritimo Street and down that space. So congestion there, congestion now already. It's gridlocked on a Saturday morning, on a weekday, trying to get around the shops and all the construction around Kenneth Road, around Rosebery Street, around the Manly Valley area. And they've all been identified as hubs based on having a beeline bus stop there. So the concept is that they have a beeline bus stop. So let's not, I don't get it. Why do we want to build a tunnel which is 3 lanes both ways? Like, that's bigger than underneath the Sydney Harbour Bridge, into the middle of, spewing out in the middle of Manly Vale, which is already of an afternoon. You already get gridlocked back up the road. So it's not, there's no, we will have congestion down the Northern Beaches. Yeah.
Ms. Collins, can I invite any further question detail you may wish to give given on notice. We'll now go to the government for its questioning time. I think, is it Mr. Mallard?
Appear to be the case. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for the witnesses for your submission and your evidence today. I mean, I think we've pretty much explored your position fairly clearly, not supporters of the project. The issue to me is when you're talking about the benefits of the infrastructure and you're talking about reduced travel times, which is what the government often talks about when it does these projects. But to me, the benefits are the unclogging or assistance to small businesses and medium businesses, and there's quite a lot of them on the peninsula. Small manufacturing. I've been up there to get some goods and services through my catering business through my partner in the past that need better access to the markets of Sydney for their goods and services. So do you acknowledge that that is a benefit that needs to be understood?
Sorry, who are you addressing a question to?
Anyone can have a go at that one.
I think that of course, the benefits need to be understood. And I don't think that, you're saying that we're opposing the project. We're actually talking about the impacts of the project. We're not opposing the project per se.
Okay.
From what we know about the project now, what we can see in the EIS is increased congestion around the entries to the tunnel, which will create a worsening local traffic situation for all the way to French's Forest and probably down to Manly. That will make it difficult for the people that you would like to take advantage of the tunnel and where it goes, which of course, yes, that's obviously desirable for business, to get into the tunnel. So I think that the real key, I imagine, with our group is that we really want the impacts better understood and better studied, so we know what's going to happen with the traffic around the tunnel portals, if that makes sense.
Well, that's something.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in.
That's something we could pick up on in our recommendation to make sure they've got good review of that, good oversight on those tunnel portal points. And we had that evidence from North Sydney Council, or the people from North Sydney earlier in the week or last week. So that's a good point. Sorry, the other members, please.
So I think Anne Collins. I think it's really around at what cost, and I think I'm very supportive of small businesses, and I'm very supportive of the supplies and so forth. And I know, like, Brookvale is a major hub, as is Manly Vale and so forth, but they're clogged to the gunnels, and it's not about getting into the city and out again necessarily. It's about you get stuck when you land in the local traffic network. So I know there was a major study done by Transport New South Wales on Brookvale and that industrial area with Northern Beaches Council, because that's an area where also they're looking at putting in more housing and so forth. But similarly, and we asked for a preferred infrastructure report into the similar sort of thing happening around the Manly Vale Balgala area, because it just hasn't been considered properly. And there are a whole range of, policies and housing strategy and tunnel and development and so forth that are just all piling on top of it. And if you build a tunnel, thinking about it, if you build a tunnel, you've got that construction site on top of that as well. So if you have your already congested Spit Bridge with two access points being congested because they're being built for 6-7 years, the place grinds to a massive halt. So those small businesses that might have got off the ground again after COVID and having all of these sorts of things are going to be isolated, stuck anyway, unless we do some other light touches, unless you spread it out and do some staggered development and look at it and consider properly the recommendations in the EIS, like the things about the groundwater and the Middle Harbour. His report said you need to be studying for a year to see what the implications and so forth. They've taken 6 sample points. It's just not enough information to make those grandiose plans. And it's not an easy job. I'm not saying it's an easy job, but please don't do it half-heartedly and look back and go, oh, whoops, I wish we'd done X, Y, Z, when we have some opportunity to have a stop and think at this point. The Health Minister says this is the biggest change that we've had in since the 1914, the last pandemic. So let's grab it by the horns. Let's look at the processes, look at the changes and incorporate them in the planning going forward, rather than just bowling down the back of the envelope plan that where are we going to end up? Sorry.
All right.
Thank you.
No, made your position clear. Any other contributions?
Yeah, so Colin Cardwell here. I just also want to reiterate that we're not opposed to the tunnel either as a PNC. We're neither for or against it. And, you know, from a personal perspective, I think the potential is that there are a number of benefits for the tunnel. But once again, the feeling is that it's being rushed through and not enough consideration for the impacts in our instance for the school. And so, you know, the construction site is right next to the school. There are going to be impacts, but we're only just starting conversations about what might be done to mitigate those. And it's just not enough time. I think it needs to be paused.
And Sandy Hoy here. The only benefit to the school is any mitigating measures and compensation aspects that we might be able to negotiate with the state government. During construction, it'll be just horrendous around that school site. And the only benefits would be after the construction, when everything settles down, and any benefits to the school infrastructure or to the open space at Balgala Oval across the road. That's really the only benefits of the tunnel that we could see.
And I said this in questioning of other witnesses on this inquiry and other inquiries. I talk about a plan B, but you really need to negotiate a good package of benefits for the school or for your area. And I guess doing that directly with the Transport for New South Wales is important. But you'd be doing the right thing. I heard from you and someone earlier, talking to your local members and getting them to make representations around the impacts on the school and how to make a better outcome. So you're doing that.
Yeah, can I just respond to that though?
I just hang on, Colin. Sorry, you don't have your surname on the screen. I work off the screen. Ms. Hoy was about to say something. So let her go first.
Oh no, that's okay. I'll hand over to Colin.
Okay, no worries.
Colin Cardwell. Sorry, I didn't have my surname. So look, I think that. Sorry, that interruption. I've just my thoughts have escaped.
I was talking about negotiating a package.
Yes, sorry. Yes,
go with the local member.
Yeah, indeed. So look, there's conversations that we have with the local member, but we're a group of volunteers. This is a complex project. I don't understand why it's our responsibility to look into this. Surely there should be some funding put in place to investigate what's required for the school.
Well, we look to the community to give us feedback. I mean,
feedback is one thing. There's a plan that needs to be put in place.
Well, I think that's the way government usually operates, to get that feedback and then respond. Although in the EIS and in the approval, there'll be conditions there, I expect, and they'll pick up on this inquiry and some of the sensible recommendations we might make. But that'll do me, Mr. Chair. I don't know if Mr. Franklin has any questions. No, not. And that's it from the government.
Okay.
So I get rewarded for ending.
It's a minute remaining. The 30-second gift that you've given me is most appreciated, Mr. Mallard. Can I just thank witnesses for their extensive submissions to the inquiry? You have taken some questions on notice for which you'll have 21 days to return an answer after you receive the transcript from the Secretariat. You are now excused, and can we welcome our next set of witnesses, please?
Thank you.
Yeah.
We are just working through some technical issues with one of the witnesses, so we'll use the gift of Mr. Mallard's 30 seconds to resolve that. Yeah, we'll just still give it an additional 1 minute just to allow the issues to resolve. So we are just having some issues connecting Mr. Kelly to this panel. But whilst the Secretariat continues to try to resolve those issues, we will welcome our three witnesses who are here now, and thank you for joining us. I will ask each witness to state their name and position and take either an oath or an affirmation, as has been emailed to you by the Secretariat. Starting with you, Ms. Brown. You are, thank you.
Okay. My name is Gabby Brown. I'm the Facebook administrator for Roselle against WestConnex, and I will be reading the oath, sorry. I swear that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God.
Thank you. Can I invite Mr. Holliday to go next, please?
Yes, so my name is Bill Holliday, and I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now is about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. And can I invite Mr. Pragg to please go next?
Certainly, yeah. My name's Ben Pragg. I'm a member of Roselle Public School Parents and Citizens Association, former Vice President. I'll read the affirmation. I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. We will ask each group to make a short opening statement, and then we'll see whether or not we've succeeded in having Mr. Kelly join us. So I'll start, invite a representative of Roselle against WestConnex to make an opening statement of no more than 3 minutes if you so wish.
Okay, my name's Bill Holliday, and I represent Roselle against WestConnex. Motorways don't solve city traffic problems. Railways do. And my submission 20 calculates by how much. It demonstrates that one rail line can carry 12 times as many people in peak hour as a lane of motorway. As well, there is no need for parking space at each end of the journey, no exhaust pollution or particulates, no road deaths, and commuters can work while they travel. Our current system is a radial one without enough north-south connecting lines. Sydney needs a properly interconnected railway network like Tokyo or London. One aspect of the project needs a redesign. The entire WestConnex tunnel system south of the harbour is actually below sea level. There are no waterproof doors, and it would flood completely if the proposed under-harbour tunnel were breached by a truck explosion. Either the Western Harbour tunnel should be dug through solid rock well below the harbour floor, or the connecting tunnel should ramp up to above sea level before it connects to the Roselle interchange. This vulnerability to terrorist attack needs to be fixed now, while the tunnel is at the pre-construction stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Holliday. I'll invite Mr. Pragg to make an opening statement if he so wishes.
Thank you. Yes. Firstly, I'd like to thank members of the committee for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I've actually tabled a document for your consideration, and I'd like to refer to it in a minute. I've been a member of Roselle Public School PNC since my daughter started kindergarten back in 2015. My evidence to the inquiry today relates primarily to the increased truck emissions resulting from the planned dive site opposite the school. But more concerning to us is the completely insubstantial response we received when we raised these concerns in our submission to the original environmental impact statement. If I could draw your attention to figure 1 in the supporting document I've submitted, it shows that the proposed WHT2 dive site on Victoria Road directly opposite the school, which is also right next to the Darling Street Junction, one of the busiest intersections in Sydney. According to the data predictions in the EIS, there will be a 30% above normal increase in heavy vehicles during the morning peak period to service this site. Incredibly, the government brushed off our concerns about a massive increase in diesel emissions with a one-line response to the effect of local air quality is largely dependent on background air quality. A simple Google search will tell you how inaccurate and irresponsible this statement is. But here's some real data. If you look at table 1 in the document I've submitted, it shows the readings from the government's closest air quality monitoring unit, which is over 200 meters from Victoria Road and is surrounded by trees. The screenshot is from the Department of Planning and Industry and the Environment's website for June the 1st this year. It was a pre-lockdown weekday. As you can see, even the maximum hourly averages for Rozelle fall into the government's good air quality category. Now compare those readings with the engine emission pollutants, nitrogen dioxide and ozone from the unit that we have on our own school grounds. In table 2, you can see the school's average readings over the whole day are worse than the Callan Park monitor, but our maximum hourly average during rush hour is much worse and takes us into the zone regarded as poor. Shockingly, it would only take a 10% increase in ozone during morning peak for the children's air quality to jump into the very poor red zone. And as the government has already told us, diesel emissions will increase by 30% during construction. Surely, we've always said that putting a dive site of this scale next to a primary school is extremely irresponsible. That opinion can hardly be considered controversial. Surely any consultative process that is worth its salt, that considers the environment and the impact on hundreds of primary school children, would have recognised this and resulted in alternative plans. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Pragg. And we now welcome Mr. Kelly as well, who's joined us. Mr. Kelly, I'm just going to ask you to state your name and position and take either an oath or an affirmation, please.
My name is Robert Kelly. I'm representing the Western Harbour Tunnel Action Group. I solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence now about to be given by me shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, would you like to make a short opening statement of no more than 3 minutes?
Yes, thank you. I'm a civil engineer by profession and I've run many large-scale construction projects in Australia. I more recently ran a large property investment firm and I'm very familiar with the concepts around risk and return of investments. First point I'd like to make about the project goes to the business case and the post-COVID-19 impacts on the project. Forecasting tunnel volumes in Australia has historically been very wide of the mark. For example, Sydney Cross City Tunnel, where traffic ended up being 1/3 of the forecast 85,000 vehicles per day, and the Clem 7 Tunnel in Brisbane, where traffic ended up being 1/4 of the projected volume. So these were clearly grossly off the mark. As it stands at present and was discussed in the hearings on Monday of this week, the project benefit cost ratio at the moment shows this project to be pretty marginal. It was expressed as 1.1 on Monday. Taking into account the COVID impact, there are many changes that have occurred which are likely to materially impact on the project. For example, working from home has now become an entrenched concept, with forecasts varying from 10 to 30% of the workforce working from home long term. Secondly, people are now more inclined to live, shop, and socialize more locally. Property experts are forecasting more decentralized office workers, likely leading to a significant change of traffic patterns and a move away from a centralized dominant Sydney CBD. Given all of the above impacts and the enormous overestimation of traffic, it's clearly possible that the project could turn out to be a financial catastrophe. It would seem irresponsible not to pause the project now or to use the delays being experienced to reevaluate the business case for the project. Indeed, it may not even be possible to responsibly reevaluate the project during the current COVID outbreak. In current conditions, no consultant will take any responsibility for any forecast produced. Therefore, it would be better to defer the further consideration of the project business case until the economy has stabilized post-pandemic. If the tunnel is to proceed, the major concern of the Western Harbour Tunnel Action Group is the environmental risk that is the dredging of contaminated sediments poses to Sydney Harbour, which is the jewel that differentiates Sydney around the world. The casualness with which this risk is viewed is summed up in the last two paragraphs in the EIS of section 17.4.2, marine water quality. One paragraph states that the dredging programme would not have a significant impact on marine water quality and that localised increases in suspended sediments will not be a problem due to the rapid dispersion in Sydney Harbour. The next paragraph states that shallow silt curtains shall be used around dredging activities, as deep silt curtains can't be used due to tidal currents and maritime traffic within Sydney Harbour. These paragraphs are essentially a concession that contamination will spread through the Sydney Harbour, which of course is totally unacceptable. There must be stronger controls and standards imposed on the project to mitigate against these risks. In closing, smart cities around the world are planning for more pedestrians and bicycles, fewer cars, even pre-COVID, and these themes have only been reinforced further by the onset of the COVID pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. We'll now begin with questioning, starting with the opposition. So I might just ask a few questions. Can I first direct these questions to you, Mr. Pragg? Mr. Frank, you made reference, I think, in your submission about, and in your opening statement, to the number of truck movements that will be near your school. And can you just tell us about whether or not that's creating any apprehension in your school community?
Well, I think so. It's not just the number of truck movements, it's how they're going to be funneled in and out of the dive site. Again, in the diagram, you can see that there is a plan to kind of for trucks to turn across Victoria Road. This is obviously an area that's exceptionally congested during the morning peak. You're going to have trucks sitting, idling, waiting to get in and out of the dive site. That is basically going to be, you know, right next to the Darling Street Junction, where there's a huge amount of congestion. The increase in diesel emissions is going to be quite concerning. And yeah, I think there's a general apprehension amongst the community and parents of, you know, we're talking about primary school aged children here. There's also a preschool on site. Yeah, there's a great amount of apprehension, definitely.
Have you had the opportunity to have this dialogue directly with Transport for New South Wales or the government about the fears your school community has?
Well, in this case, we haven't had an opportunity. Obviously, we were affected by Westconnex Stage 3, it's particularly Stage 3A in the past. And we had discussions with the people from I believe it's defunct now, but the Sydney Motorway Corporation, which was kind of like a quasi-government, quasi-private company, did come in to discuss things with us. And then it wasn't a constructive forum. We had issues whereby somebody leaked something to the media and then they basically refused to come back in again. So in the past, these things have not been, they've been suboptimal, I would say. And in this case, we've had no offers from the government, Transport for New South Wales or anything like that to discuss these issues with us at all. Like I said, the response, I mean, it's obviously there's 26 chapters in the EIS. The response is, you know, almost the same size. Trawling through the response to the EIS, it's clear that our concerns were just brushed off. You know, one word, you know, throwaway statements. Oh, don't worry about it. It's only a short amount of time. Don't worry about it. You know, no data to back up what they're talking about, really.
But sorry, Mr. Pratt, can I just? You said that the last meaningful form of consultation was to do with 3B part of WestConnex. Is that right? Yeah. So you haven't actually had any direct contact about the Western Harbour Tunnel?
No, not that I'm aware of.
All right. And well, I mean, look, we've heard evidence from other schools on the other side of the harbour that says that they have. Were you aware that those schools were getting consultation, or?
I was not. I have brief conversations with them occasionally, but I wasn't aware that they'd been directly approached. Now, like I said, I'm aware of what the P&C has been approached with. It's possible that the school management, the principal, has been approached. We've had he's a new principal who just came into the job, and the principal, the principal's position was vacant for some time while they were trying to get a new principal. So it's possible. I don't know that there was an attempt to contact the school and discuss it with us, but look, I'm the point man for all these discussions in terms of P&C. I've been doing it since WestConnex. Nobody's ever approached me or come to me.
Thanks. I was actually going to ask Roselle against WestConnex to respond to what is your experiences, I guess, with the cumulative impact of all these projects which are taking place in the Roselle community. That which had to do with WestConnex, that which to do with Western Harbour Tunnel. And equally, I imagine your community will be affected by the Western Metro as it's built too. So I would be very interested, can you describe how your group feels about the cumulative impacts of these projects on the Inner West?
I'd just like to mention that the Gabby has a statement and she was passed over in terms of the statement. So if she could be heard.
Sorry, look, I did say that one representative of each organisation to allow for. So I'm happy if Ms. Brown would table her statement.
Mr. Chair, the government's prepared to cede some of our question time to hear this statement. We don't really have a lot of questions on this one.
Okay, well, thank you for the government. That will permit us now to hear from Ms. Brown if she wishes to make that statement as well. And please go ahead, keep it short, but then can you respond to the question? And can I just ask the Secretariat to just suspend the questioning time right now that you are keeping And whatever time Ms. Brown takes, we'll deduct it from the government after Mr. Mallard's very generous offer.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Gabby Brown. I am a member of Roselle Against WestConnex and the Roselle Against WestConnex Facebook administrator. I wanted to speak to the fact that we're deeply concerned about the impact the construction will have on people's physical and mental health, and post-construction, the impact that the pollution will have on their health. The pollution that we see coming out of these unfiltered 5 stacks will cause serious damage to residents and the surrounding suburbs, and we have made recommendations that filters be put on the stacks, in the tunnels, and that pollution monitors be placed next to these stacks and exit portals for the public to be able to view the level of pollution coming out every single day. Based on past experience with the St. Peter's interchange in at Ashfield, we've also seen that WestConnex is already a project that causes physical damage to properties, leading residents to move out and sell their homes far below original market value due to WestConnex. From this, we believe we can safely assume that the Western Harbour Tunnel will cause the same damage to residents of the area. Roselle Against WestConnex believes that the state government should complete an infrastructure construction health impact study. We also would like confirmation that the construction of the Western Harbour Tunnel will not delay delivery of the WestConnex Roselle Rail Yards public park. The lack of filtration from these stacks or exit portals also means that the particulate matter 2.5, an incredibly dangerous form of pollution known to cause heart disease, lung cancer, respiratory issues and strokes, will be spreading all across the surrounding suburbs. There is very clear evidence that people who live downstream of the M5 East Torella plume saw a 44% increase in lung cancer rates, and that study was carried out by the CSIRO. That's what I mostly wanted to speak to. In terms of the cumulative impact that we've faced over the last 5 years from WestConnex and the Western Harbour Tunnel, I can only speak personally as the Facebook administrator that I've had many people come to me desperately joining the group and saying, I can't sleep at night, the construction is terrible, I've been trying to negotiate rent reduction, but speaking with fair trading, it's completely impossible. That's what I've seen is the mental and physical impact that noise construction going. I've got evidence that's going into the wee hours at 3 in the morning with people unable to sleep despite, being given headphones or being offered to move out or, again, trying to sell their house below market value so that they can get out of the area. I think that's been incredibly degrading to people's sense of connection and community to the area and to their mental health. I've had our co-Facebook administrator, she now lives in Byron Bay because she couldn't, she lived on one of the streets that was very, very deeply impacted by the construction. So I can speak to that, but Bill, did you also have something that you wanted to talk to about the cumulative impacts that we've faced?
No, I think you've done that very, very well there, Gabby.
Okay.
Thank you. I was just going to ask a question again of Roselle Against WestConnex about, can you tell us about the experience your members have had with the acquisition and substratum acquisition processes with WestConnex and whether or not you're aware of what type of meaningful changes do you think is necessary for this project?
How would you define meaningful changes?
Well, to be fair, that's really for you to define what's a meaningful change, not really for me. It's more a case of having your experience with those acquisitions, particularly the substratum acquisitions. Is there any views you have for the committee as to the type of changes you'd like to see for the Western Harbour Tunnel project on that particular question?
Well, I haven't spoken to the residents around the Birchgrove Balmain Peninsula area who will be affected, so I can't say to exactly what they would want out of that, honestly. But I just know from the residents of, Callan Street and Springwood Street that were completely ripped up in the process that I think they felt like, especially rat runs were a big concern, and these incredibly huge, these trucks with their dogs, they're huge, they carry 18 to 23 tons. They definitely have safety concerns about rat runs occurring in their back streets. I think that's one thing that could definitely be alleviated, especially with Roselle Public School being a school where there are many young families and children walking around. I think any safety, that I think that would be quite a reassurance to know that the trucks will not be parking in streets, blocking off areas, also causing safety concerns for people walking around with new extra rat runs to be used by these trucks. I think that's one thing I can speak to.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, can I ask you just about the action group? Can you just tell us a bit about your action group, what it is, how many people are in it, where are you based, and what your basic view and call to action is about this project?
Sure. We've got 80 to 90 local residents in Balmain and Birchgrove, and we've attended meetings variously through the last probably 3 years. So I guess we're combining the views of the local residents here. Look, I think there's a general concern about all of the matters that were raised earlier, and you know, as I said earlier, I think COVID alone has to throw a huge question mark over the analysis of the project, because, for example, if companies were to say have people working from home, say 2 days a week, they settled on that as a strategy, that would mean that ultimately you'd have an equivalent of about 40% vacancy rate in Sydney office buildings, because companies would rotate the space between staff. So you wouldn't need another office building in Sydney for 15 to 20 years. These kind of things have huge impacts on traffic volumes, and people are now, you know, they've got used to working from home, and companies can now see that it works. So the fear that they had before that people couldn't really work from home is gone, and that's a very huge behavioural thing. And as I mentioned, the sediments was very well covered this morning by Bill Ryle and others, so I don't think I need to go back into that.
Right. Mr. Pegg, is there any specific, or Prag, sorry, is there any specific immediate steps you think would assist your school community that this committee can meaningfully help you get?
I think you could abandon the dive site, WH2T2 dive site. There's a precedence for it. The Darley Street dive site as part of WestConnex 3, stage 3 was abandoned. I appreciate it would make the project would take longer, but we're dealing with the health and safety of primary school age children here. It's a wholly inappropriate site for a dive site, and that's really short of mandating electric trucks or emission-free trucks, which I don't even think construction companies in Australia have. I don't see what any other solution there is.
Okay. I think the opposition's time has just expired. So how's that for perfect? Ms. Boyd, over to you to take from the crossbench.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you very much to our witnesses for appearing today and for your very considered submissions. I wanted to talk to you about, I guess, as people who have experienced the last however many years of WestConnex, often with these projects where we're told that a lot of the foreshadowed risks, at least, will be mitigated in some way, and a series of conditions is placed on construction companies and the like. What has been your experience with what was promised throughout the sort of planning process, and what the reality has been in terms of compliance by you know, particularly those involved in construction, and what your rights have been, and how effective you've been able to draw non-compliance to government attention? We start.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know if that was directed to anybody in particular, but I sit on the WestConnex reference group, which has now been disbanded, which all the community members are quite upset by, because it is our best opportunity to hold the government and the contractors to account. You know, there's not a meeting goes by where it's not there's broken promises raised. Just sort of like be they informal or formal promises. You know, we've seen what's happened. I don't have a WestConnex example, but we've seen what happened with Parramatta Road. You know, that was supposed to be bus lanes, but of course there was actually no date that they had to deliver by, so that can just get kicked down the road. When you know, we're supposed to get active transport about WestConnex, you know, again, between Iron Cove Bridge and the Anzac Bridge, we've not seen any example of it. You know, it's just greenwashing, I really believe. You know, that it's ticking boxes to get projects approved, and then it's very easy to break those promises later down the line.
Thank you. Ms. Brown?
I only have experience really from 2017-18, which is a while ago, so I can't remember exactly what was talked about in those meetings. I do remember the one stack, the singular stack that they're building just before the Iron Cove Bridge in Rozelle. I'm not sure how they're going with that actually, so I can't speak to it too much, but I do recall a lot of the meetings in 2017 with them saying, oh, like, yes, a couple houses will be gone, just a couple, don't worry, like your houses down on Callan Street, Springwood Street, they'll be fine. They have been so incredibly disturbed and completely ripped out of the ground, I think more than anybody ever expected. They obviously sold that the impacts would be minimal and very well managed. I think everyone can see that the impacts have been felt by like hundreds of residents, not just a few. They did also talk about when they're expanding that roadway, as they'll be taking out houses on both sides of Victoria Road near Terry Street and also Callan Street, Springwood Street, Tawley Street, that, you know, there'd be a lovely bike ramp and it would be green and they'd be building trees. I can't see if they're going to do that yet, but it'd be nice to see a lovely little garden island in the middle. I don't think we're going to see one. So that's still to be seen. But I do know that they did say, you know, the impact on taking out the houses will be quite minimal. Of course, no need to worry, but so many people I know are now gone from that area completely, and had to, if they didn't have their houses removed, they had to sell and leave because the damage was so terrible. So no, they didn't destroy your house physically, but they made it so unbearable to live there that you had to pack up and leave. That's what I've seen.
Thank you. Thank you. And Mr. Kelly, do you have sort of confidence, I guess, in conditions being met by the government?
Yeah, my main concern really is money being thrown away on an irresponsible investment. I mean, when you look at the forecasts for the previous projects, it's hard to have any confidence in the traffic numbers, which are the key. You know, that's the key component. That's the revenue for this project in the future. You know, I question it as it stands, and I throw COVID on top and say, well, could it be 20 or 30% less with COVID alone? And the answer is, in my mind, is yes. So if the project is showing a 1.1 coefficient, you know, it could easily lose 20 or 30%, and you know, and money is getting thrown down the drain. So, you know, I just think that's quite irresponsible, and it is our money. So yeah, put aside the environmental considerations, and there are very many. You know, the question was asked this morning: do you want a second harbour crossing? You can't really answer a question like that in isolation of responsible investment analysis.
So
yes, I'd like to say something too.
Sorry, Mr. Holliday.
Yes, look, the fact is that you could solve a lot of these problems by putting in a railway line, just one line in the under harbour tunnel that would be built out of 3 lanes. You'd increase the traffic, the people carrying capacity by 4.6 times by putting in by replacing one traffic lane with a rail line, and of course that would reduce the pollution, and it also mean that you wouldn't be you would be encouraging traffic in the Sydney Basin, and that would reduce the pollution levels for the whole of Sydney.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Talking about the sort of the fact, I guess, that everything has changed in terms of the impact of COVID, and we don't know how much of that will snap back to how it used to be and how much of it has changed forever. In addition to that, I guess, disrupting the basis on which a lot of the EIS was produced, does it also, in terms of traffic flow, does it also have an impact in terms of numbers of people being at home, being more impacted by construction compared to what it would have been a few years ago?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I mean, just anecdotally, our suburban coffee shops are up 30% since pre-COVID. So that just is an illustration of the amount of people that are around locally. So I guess proportionately that amount of additional stress. Noise, noise again is going to be a very big one as well, because noise transmission over the water is a huge issue as well.
So would it be fair to say then that the difficulties residents have experienced in the construction of WestConnex so far with noise and vibration and the stresses, and perhaps this is a question for you, Ms. Brown, would it be fair to say that when people are, particularly if lockdowns continue, forced to stay within their homes for more of the day, that stress will be compounded?
Absolutely, 100%. Yeah, can't say anything except for 100%. I've just had some local residents who've moved into the area who this was like mid last year, when we were definitely still in lockdown around April, May 2020. And I definitely got a higher volume of people contacting me on the Facebook group saying that they couldn't sleep at night, that they hadn't slept for days, and that you can't leave your house, you can't go to this proposed motel due to lockdown. So they were definitely very, very stressed, and I felt very awful and responsible trying to explain to them, sadly, that we can't do anything and that fair trading can't do anything, and you couldn't probably negotiate that rent reduction that you want to negotiate. Yeah, I did also want to say real quick, just to what Robert Kelly was talking about and Bill, that we were also very upset that the government never even went ahead talking about rail lines. They have never even considered trying to put in an alternative transport strategy. They never even considered what like a public transport alternative could be for this area. It's never been taken seriously. They always went straight to WestConnex, straight to the Western Harbour Tunnel, and I think we've always found that very disappointing, especially, this thing is already so destructive to our health and to our environment, and the fact that they never considered that and just said we'll put in some trees and parks to make up for it. Always found that very disappointing too. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't have much time left, but I think with my last question, and perhaps it's to you, Mr. Holliday, but if not, let me know. I'm interested in how Australia compares with other parts of the world when it comes to the filtering that we put on our tunnels.
I believe that in Japan they have in-tunnel filtration on several tunnels, and I also believe that that they have filtration in tunnels in Europe, and I think the only test they've had of tunnel filtration has been on the M5, and if you look at the evaluation report on that from I think it was 2008. The AMOG, the M5 East Tunnel Filtration Trial, they basically only had the filtration running for 6 hours a day out of 24, and neither of the filtrations that they were doing, which one was for PMs and total suspended particles, or the NOx filter, none of them were set up properly so that they could work. The filters for the electrostatic filters for the particle matter things didn't work because all the particles clumped together and then broke off in a great lump periodically, and so you still had these much larger particles going into the airstream, and the NOx filters, they were boxes full of activated charcoal, and but the top of the box was empty, so the air that was supposed to be filtered just went straight over the top of the activated charcoal and not through it. And so there was virtually no absorption of the NOx, the nitrogen dioxide, or the nitrogen oxide at all. And as a result, the roads and motorings, the RMS, the roads and motoring and maritime service has poo-pooed the idea of filtration ever since.
Thank you. Crossbench time has come to an end, so it's over to the government. Mr. Mallard.
Oh, well, thank you, Mr. Chair. I suppose I've got 1 minute or something left after our generous.
You have 9, Mr. Mallard. You have 9 minutes. So
9 minutes. I don't think I need 9, but maybe Mr. Franklin might take up some of that. Take the cue. Look, I've said this, asked this question and explored this issue earlier with other witnesses. I mean, and I preface it by saying I've recently been appointed Parliamentary Secretary for Infrastructure, and I've been involved in active transport, public transport debate since the 1980s, when I was just a young guy involved with the Greiner government, and back then it was just building freeways. Now, this government very much has a balanced approach, and it's probably got the most balanced approach in the history of the state. We're building. I heard you saying, Ms. Brown, there's been no consideration of a rail crossing. There's actually right now being constructed under the harbour, almost the same below this location of this proposed tunnel, a rail tunnel for the revolutionary CBD metro, which goes from Kellyville to Bankstown, and will kick on later on to Liverpool and the airport probably. And then there's other transport initiatives that the state government's doing parallel to this road infrastructure, which is to unclog the economy as much as anything else. So I wouldn't mind just acknowledging that it's not just not singular view about transport from this government. It is a balanced view of public transport, new ferries, light rail, metro rail, new trains. Would you acknowledge that?
Well, I can probably speak to that, and that is that well, you haven't put in the rail line that was part of the Bradfield concept up to the northern beaches, and also the metro system you've brought in stops one station short of connecting to the heavy rail system at Schofields. It's only about 3 kilometres to go from the last station at Tallawong through to the heavy rail line that goes up to Windsor and Richmond, and the government has simply refused to connect it, and that would make a big difference to the amount of traffic in the inner west, because there must be a lot of people who have to drive to get to work in the morning simply because there's no connection between those two rail lines.
I haven't heard that before, but I'm making the point though that well, first of all, I mean, Bradfield, we've moved on. I mean, now we're doing radial public transport connections, for example, from where I live, from Aerotropolis, from the airport, right through to St Mary's and ultimately up to Kellyville with Metro. So we're now doing the rings around the city to make the city more connected together. There is a strategy there.
But I think we were more concerned about the fact that we never saw it considered specifically in the space precinct with Rozelle. Like, I do support the Metro. I think there has been a lot of great public transport infrastructure brought through. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. I've definitely seen that happen and it's great, but it's the fact that we were never given that alternative to even consider, even after, I remember years of asking, why can't we just have an investigation into what could be possible, and why does this have to be the only option that we're given? I think that was where we really felt trapped into a corner with WestConnex.
And there's certainly a strategy to put metro stations at the base precinct of fish markets and further along on the Western Metro, which is now under development, which will help alleviate some of that issue as well. Mr. Holiday, I think it was talking about the issue of the financing, which I'm interested in too. Excuse me. And you cited 2 tunnels that didn't meet the projections of car usages. That was right. The one in Brisbane and the one in the cross city.
That was me, Robert Kelly.
Oh, Mr. Kelly, sorry. Yeah, you've moved in spots on my screen. That's right. Sorry about that. So, Mr. Kelly, I mean, I had a lot of involvement as a councillor in the City of Sydney with the cross city tunnel, and those figures. I'll come to this relevancy in a second. Those figures were based on the portal at the museum, and they were just extrapolated, not redone, before going out to Rushcutters Bay when they changed, and that's where that failed. But the point is, the failure wasn't borne by the taxpayer. I mean, that tunnel was privatised. The private operator went down the drain. The only cost to taxpayers was the GST that they hadn't paid to Canberra, and then it was taken up by another operator. So the risk was all private sector, and the loss was all private sector. So, not suggesting the decision's been made on privatising this piece of infrastructure, but I'm just pointing out that the risk on the investment is taken by the private sector, and it certainly was the case with the Cross City Tunnel. And you're saying that the taxpayer is taking huge risk in this projection to be all wrong, and will lose a lot of money. But I'm putting it to you that the private sector will make that assessment in due course if we go down the path of privatisation. Based on
just make a point. The private sector, can generally assess projects sensibly, and therefore, the government will either end up having to provide a guarantee of traffic numbers, which will be a shortfall, and the investor will have a government bond or something. So, the private sector isn't going to stumble into a loss-making project and make a loss with its eyes open, in my experience.
I agree with that, but it hasn't been an appetite to take up the.
I think Mr. Prague is trying to get the call, so we might go to Mr. Prague.
Sorry, I'm here really just to represent the school, but when you talk about the private sector, if that's genuinely the way it worked and the private sector just took the risk, even let's take away the fact that Transurban don't pay their taxes in Australia or whatever. Anyway, let's take that out of the equation. That would be fine if that was 100% true, but I don't know what the plans are with Western Harbour Tunnel, but with West Connex, I can't remember, stage 2 or stage 3, possibly both, because they didn't, my understanding is that the government had to write in a guarantee if traffic numbers fell so low that they would then basically pay them what they were losing in revenue. So you're not taking risk out of the equation, because everybody knows that people don't want to use toll roads, and that the numbers never stack up. They never get the numbers that they're supposed to. So absolutely, if it was the same deal for the Cross City Tunnel and the Lane Cove Tunnel, for Western Harbour Tunnel, West Connex, I probably wouldn't have as much of a problem in terms of finances. But it's not. We're basically, you're giving the private companies like this sweet deal where they don't pay taxes, and you're taking all their risk away. And who's got to pay for it? The taxpayer. It's just crazy.
I think we'll agree to disagree then on that one, but I just wanted to make that observation. I mean, the Cross City Tunnel is often cited as an example, and in fact, the taxpayer didn't lose any money. A little bit of GST at Canberra on that one. So I've got a lot of detail on that. Mr. Franklin, would you like to ask some questions? My colleague from Byron Bay.
Thanks, Mr. Mallard, and thanks, Chair. Look, I only had one question actually, and that was to Mr. Kelly. I just noticed in your submission that you talked about the importance of dealing with contamination, particularly in construction support sites such as Berries Bay, which I totally agree with, and think that is a critical issue. But that just made me think about the legacy project, which is potentially mooted for Berries Bay, and I was just interested in your views about that, about the what's been suggested so far, and what ideas you might have in your expertise about what can be best done for that facility once the project's finished. You're just on mute, Mr. Kelly.
Yep. Sorry. Look, I'm not across the detail. I'm not across the detail of the legacy project on Berries Bay. I guess similar to Bill Ryle today, we tended to concentrate on the route of across the harbour, which we're familiar with and close to. Are you referring to reinstatement of the?
Yeah, just returning it to being public open space, and a whole range of the different possibilities being able to be used there, whether it be having a plaza or public access to the beach, launching kayaks, a shared use path, native tree planting, all of that sort of thing, which has been mooted, which to me seems like a wonderful idea. But I just wanted the views from the community, and would be interested in the views of other members, other witnesses, if they'd like to make any comments about that. Or not, that's fine too.
Well, I think
Back
that,
to you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Franklin, time has expired.
That's convenient.
So we thank the witnesses for joining us this afternoon. I understand that you have taken some questions on notice, so you'll have 21 days to return an answer after the receipt from the Secretariat. That brings the public hearing to a close. We thank all the witnesses who have appeared today. This panel is excused. We will now terminate the broadcast, and can I just ask all members to stay on for the deliberative?
Thank you very much for the opportunity.